The Trail of Chains, a serialized historical Christian romance. Sonnets of the Spice Isle, Book 5. Written by Lynnette Bonner. Narrated by Mary Sarah Agliotta. Part 1. Psalm 107:14. He brought them out of darkness, the utter darkness, and broke away their chains. Captured and chained, while Chief Banda's village is sacked. RyAnne pressed her face into her hands, but didn't bother wiping the tears that tracked down her cheeks. The manacles around her wrists and ankles were padded on the inside with leather, presumably to keep her skin from scarring. RyAnne had hoped the padding would give some leeway that might allow her to pull herself free, but all her efforts had been fruitless. The blood seeping along one of her wrists was proof of that, and the other end of the chain had been locked to the sturdy, thick trunk of an acacia tree. Khalifa had chained her a ways back from the village, with a spear-carrying native standing guard. But even though she was in a sheltered thicket of acacia, with an occasional baobab, she was close enough to smell and even see the thick black smoke lifting from the roofs of the village huts, and to hear the cries of the people she had come to think of as her people, as they attempted to escape capture. For Khalifa hadn't contented himself with merely capturing her. Moments ago he'd sent his men in to ransack the village, with instructions to capture only the healthiest and strongest. Though her tears cascaded, a numbness had started in RyAnne's chest the moment she'd seen Trent fall, and had steadily been spreading through her in a chilling wave ever since. She should be worried about Nyimbo, Moyo, Nyanja, June, Keiko, and the other villagers, like Yani and her newborn baby and young daughter. Yet all she could think about was Trent, who at this very moment lay dead or dying, where she remained impotently powerless to help him. As she vainly tried to free her wrists once more, a cry of sheer frustration rose from inside her. The guard's expression remained impassive. Another roil of belching black smoke billowed into the sky. RyAnne shuttered her gaze, feeling the bite of the manacles against her wrists as she clutched handfuls of her hair in both fists. Thank God Papa had passed on before Khalifa's attack. It seemed forever, and yet it seemed as though hardly any time at all had passed, when Khalifa reappeared. The violin that Commodore Llewellyn Cornwall had gifted to her through the captain landed with a thud at her feet.
It is done. Stop blubbering. You will carry this on your journey to the coast. Once the bidders hear your talent on the instrument, the price we'll get for you could double.
RyAnne glowered at him. She would sooner hurl the instrument into one of the fires raging behind the man than play it and give him even a shilling more of profit. Khalifa sank to his haunches before her. He jabbed a thumb in the direction of the sacked village.
You do realize the fault for all this is yours, Miss Hunter?
He said the words with a touch of disparaging joviality, as though it pleased him greatly to deem her at fault. Indignation lifted her chin. I sit here in chains at your hand, yet you attempt to blame me. I had absolutely nothing to do with it, and well you know it.
Oh, but I beg to differ, Miss Hunter.
He folded his hands and tapped his first two fingers against his lips, studying her with that stomach-sickening humour in his eyes.
Not long ago, did you not confess to some of the village females that your grandmother hailed from this tribe?
He tilted a nod to the burning village. RyAnne's stomach pitched. But Khalifa didn't give her time to sort through the muddle of emotions swirling through her and to come up with a reply. He nodded.
Oh yes, I can see the truth dawning in your horrified eyes, Miss Hunter.
He leaned closer, as though about to impart the most important of secrets.
You see, a man named Honkulu came to me. Apparently you did something to get him banned from the village, But
he waved a hand through the air.
That is not important. What is important is that he somehow became privy to your secret, Miss Hunter. And he came to me with it. And of course, knowing the kind of price I would get for a woman of your beauty, I had to come see for myself. So you see, the fault is undeniably yours, Miss Hunter. If your blood wasn't so tainted, if you weren't so beautiful. He gave a little shrug, and his gaze slipped over her form. Revulsion riled in the pit of her stomach and whispered a chill along the back of her neck. A lecherous smirk twisted his lips. He reached out and fingered one of her curls. RyAnne jerked back and slapped his hand away, her chains clanking loudly with emotion. "Don't touch me! This is no more my fault than was the broken flower pot I smashed over your head back in the Harcourts garden." Before she could blink, she was knocked to her back with his hand wrapped around her throat. He squeezed hard enough to cut off her air. RyAnne clutched at his hand, tried to kick at him with her feet, but her chains hampered her effectiveness, and his brute strength prevailed. The edges of her vision blurred, and everything inside her ached for just one sweet breath of oxygen. This was it then. Perhaps she would be reunited with Trent sooner than she'd realized. And then just as suddenly as he'd attacked her, he released her. RyAnne's body convulsed, and she gasped for air. Khalifa straightened his sleeves as he stood to his feet. She turned on her side, feeling like she might retch, but all she could do was cough and wheeze. Pain seared through her. Weakness tremored in every muscle of her body. For a long moment she lay there, her cheek pressed against her bound hands. Then slowly she climbed to her feet, dusted off her skirts, tugged broken bits of grass and twigs from her hair, and lifted a scowl to Khalifa. He might have control of her body, but he would never be able to take her mind from her. Khalifa took in her defiance with another smirk. He lifted one hand and snapped his fingers. "Asha, come!" Khalifa pierced RyAnne with a look and tipped his head to where a man stepped out from behind a baobab with Moyo, wide-eyed and tearful at his side. "Moyo!" RyAnne stretched out her hands to the child, who barreled toward her and buried her face against RyAnne's stomach. Khalifa's eyes narrowed. "The girl will also travel with you, and if I have any trouble from you, she will be the one to suffer for it. Do you understand?" Moyo sobbed, her face pressed into the material of RyAnne's skirt. RyAnne's chains clanked garishly as she attempted to wrap her arms around the little one. Her gaze drilled into the man as she rasped, "She's your own daughter!" Khalifa's gaze flickered to the girl, and for just the fraction of a moment, RyAnne thought she saw something human reflected there. But then he threw back his shoulders and lifted his chin. "And with her light-coloured skin and those tawny eyes, she ought to fetch me a good price at the market, now that she's older." "You are a snake of the lowest form." The words were not harsh enough to convey the depth of her feelings about the man. The child was barely 4, if she was a day. RyAnne tightened her arms around the little one as best she could. Khalifa's expression mocked her. "You wound me most grievously, Miss Hunter." With a guffaw of laughter, he turned his back on her. "Be ready to travel in 5 minutes." He snapped his fingers at the guard he had called Asha, and the man stepped forward and clapped 2 tiny manacles to Moyo's wrists, unlocked RyAnne's leg chains from the acacia, and then nudged them both to start walking. RyAnne took Moyo's hand in her own, and tempted as she was to hurl the violin toward the flames that now engulfed the brush behind the last row of hearts, something made her wrap her palm around the case's handle and hang on tight instead. A loud outcry suddenly arose from Khalifa's men. "Moto!" someone yelled, and RyAnne realized the breeze off the lake was pushing the flames. The fire was hungrily racing through the brush and devouring everything in its path. The guard behind RyAnne and Moyo jabbed RyAnne with the blunt end of his spear. "Kimbia!" RyAnne recognized the Swahili command to run and knew that Moyo wouldn't stand a chance at outracing a fire. She squatted down and instructed the child to quickly climb onto her back. Moyo complied, clinging to her for dear life. Her chains gouged into RyAnne's spine. Tiny manacles grated against shoulder blades, iron conquering bone. Despite the pain, RyAnne shuffled forward, clutching her violin to her chest as she followed the guard before her. The chains around her ankles made anything more than a cantering gait impossible. Ahead she could hear cries of terror and clanking of chains. The other prisoners Khalifa had taken from the village were obviously terrified of the fires also, and RyAnne knew the wind off the lake would only pick up faster over the next hour. They could all be overtaken and burned alive.
Her legs ached, yet she ran on. Time and again her one-handed grip on Moyo's leg slipped, as her loping run yanked her chains one way or another. But a wall of flames fed by the long savanna grasses rose like a hungry orange dragon behind them. She must not stop. The brief thought that in this chaos she might chance upon the perfect opportunity for Moyo and her to escape flitted through her mind. And then the guard ahead of them disappeared into an enveloping cloud of smoke. Trent came to with a moan. His eyes flew open. "RyAnne!" He lurched upward but didn't quite make it to a sitting position before his body rebelled. He gasped at the shock of the pain. Someone pressed a hand to his chest and kept him from trying to rise once more. "Be still, Mizzy. Much hurt has come upon you. Keiko." Relief eased a breath through Trent's lips. Maybe the situation was not as bad as he feared. He cracked open one eye and peered into Keiko's concerned face, leaning over him. Water droplets glistened in the man's hair and cascaded in rivulets down his bare chest. Beside him, June was equally wet, but her horror-filled gaze was fixed on something in the distance. Trent lifted one hand to the persistent pain pulsing beneath his skull, but as he did so, shards of shattered bone ground against each other in his shoulder. A loud moan escaped him, and with a wince he gingerly lowered his arm to the ground. Keiko snapped a few words at June in the Chewa Trent was yet endeavouring to learn, and she seemed to give herself a shake as she turned her focus from whatever horror lay in the distance to examining his wounds. And horror it must be, for there existed no other word to describe the expression on her face. Trent's brow furrowed. What happened? His every thought felt muddied, but at the back of his mind lingered a strong concern for RyAnne. Keiko shook his head as though still processing the events himself. He responded in the Swahili Trent spoke fluently. "The village was raided. June and I were both down by the shore. We hid in the lake. But the rest..." He let the words trail away. June flicked a glance of sheer anger Keiko's way. "You should have let me go to them!" Keiko made a sound of disgust. "You would have been captured." "Go to who?" Trent inserted. June returned to examining the wound in his shoulder, but tears now tracked down her dark cheeks. "The young ones, Moyo and Niimbo, were both taken." There was another flicker of pain in her gaze that indicated something still deeper. Trent's gut rolled. "Nyanja." June blinked hard a few times, pressed her lips into a tight purse, and wrinkled her nose. The pain in the expression was unmistakable. She shook her head. "Anafa." Trent's eyes fell closed. Though it was Chewa, that was a word he knew. Nyanja had been killed. RyAnne would be so devastated. He couldn't believe how quickly things had changed. One moment life had been full of hope and joy as he'd walked with the woman he loved along the beach. And now, his one hope fell to the fact that Khalifa would treat her somewhat carefully because she would be worth so much. "I couldn't save her." He rolled slightly to one side to remove the painful bulge of his pistol from his lower back. "I didn't even have time to draw my gun." Keiko obliged him by tugging the weapon free and laying it on the ground next to him. Trent nodded his thanks. "How long have I been out?" June still studied and prodded his shoulder gently. "We just came upon you, but the raiders have been gone for at least an hour now. Be still a few moments more so I can clean and bandage your wounds." Trent clenched his teeth and gave in to her ministrations, only because at his current levels of pain he would be no good to RyAnne, or anyone else for that matter. Every breath sent waves of fire through his chest. Every movement produced the same effect in his abdomen and shoulder. June spoke a few words to Keiko, and he helped lift Trent partially so she could see the back of his shoulder. Pain swept through Trent, causing waves of dizziness and nausea, but he gritted his teeth and bore the anguish, willing his stomach to cease its churning. She said a few more words. Keiko eased Trent back to the sand, then touched his good shoulder gently. "You have broken ribs and a broken bone at the back of your shoulder. The spirit you speak to must have been watching out for you. June says we must cut out the bullet. But with a sling, you should recover fully in time. The slice across your abdomen is deep, but Dr. Hunter showed her how to sew such a wound closed.
You will live, Missy. Courage."
With that, Keiko slipped quietly away. June offered a sympathetic look.
"He goes to see if he can find a knife or any of Dr. Hunter's supplies. I fear to make you better. I must first hurt you worse, Missy."
Trent nodded.
"Yes, I understand."
He would take any level of pain if it meant he would sooner be able to head out to rescue RyAnne. Just as RyAnne's hopes soared that she might indeed be able to make an escape with Muyo, and she turned to flee in another direction, a hand wrapped firmly around her upper arm and yanked her forward.
"No one escapes Asha!"
The guard had doubled back for them. Despair threatening to overwhelm her, she stumbled to keep up with the man. Relentlessly, Asha prodded her onward, and yet the flames never seemed more than half a furlong behind them. Hampered as she was by the heavy manacles, it seemed they could not put enough distance between themselves and the encroaching crackle of the devouring blaze. Earlier her fears had revolved around her capture and wondering if Trent had suffered much before he died. She had beaten back the hopeful question over whether he was really dead. For of course he was. There had been so much blood, and she had never been one to linger in a fantasy of hope. But now her fears turned to keeping herself from getting burned to death and worry for Muyo. Her legs begged for rest, but still she pressed onward. The chains felt heavier with each step. Muyo also. RyAnne demanded just one more step from her muscles, and then another. She ran until her legs gave out from under her, and she crashed to the ground. Muyo's face smacked into her shoulder, and RyAnne heard her whimper. The fire wheezed a scorching belch against the skin of her legs, exposed by her fall. Terror zipped through her. "Muyo, we have to run!" The child was yanked from her back, and RyAnne started to protest the separation until she realized Asha had swung the little girl onto his own back. He bent and used a key to unclasp her manacles. Yanking them off, he thrust them into a leather bag angled across his chest, and then he prodded RyAnne to rise and run. RyAnne managed to get her legs beneath her and stumble forward, but every breath pulled in only a lungful of smoke. She coughed, her eyes watered, and she squinted to see where to place her next step. All thoughts of escape momentarily left her. Her only thought was of survival, and there was only one direction to move at this point. The conflagration marched surely and steadily behind them. The ground beneath her feet began to quake, and off in the distance she heard the dull roar of something like thunder. The guard cursed angrily and yanked RyAnne's arm to angle her movement in a line tangential to their current direction. The roar grew louder, and suddenly they were running in the midst of a herd of wildebeests, gazelles, zebras, and ostriches. Every creature on the plain seemed to have congregated together in an attempt to outrace their looming deaths, and yet they were running in a line almost parallel with the flames. If they kept going this direction, the fire would catch up to them, of a certainty. And yet there was no way to dodge through the herd and keep going away from the fire without getting knocked to the ground. So she raced along with the herds, like all the other people around her. "Do not fall, do not fall, do not fall," RyAnne chanted the words with each step. For a fall now would mean being trampled to death by the terrified animals careening along behind her. RyAnne tried to think what the captain might have told her to do in a situation like this, but in all his lectures on safety, he'd never once covered how to respond if she was running in the middle of a stampeding herd of wild animals, with a grass fire chasing hot on her heels. Tears stung her eyes. What she wouldn't give to hear him barking orders at her in that moment. Just ahead of her she heard the guard, Asha, give an exultant shout, and then she heard the distinct splashes of the animals leaping into water. A gust of wind momentarily cleared the smoke from the plain, and blessed sight! A river, wide and placid, stretched before them. The animals had instinctively known where to head. Asha hoisted Muyo to his shoulders and leapt down into the riverbed, turning to raise his hands to help RyAnne down after him. Grateful for his help, RyAnne leaned forward and took his hands, then jumped down into the water. Asha gave her a nod, turned, and waded out into the river, grasping onto the neck of a wildebeest as he kicked out into the main flow of the water. RyAnne followed suit without a second thought. It was only after she was in the middle of the current, clinging to the mane of a wild-eyed zebra, with the danger of the fire behind her, that her thoughts turned to what creatures might be lurking beneath the surface of the water, and ready to take advantage of all the meals swimming above them. She had but a fleeting moment to fear, however, for just then her feet hit ground. and she released the zebra and slogged toward the shore. As soon as she was free of the water, she fell to her knees and crawled toward Moyo, whom the guard had left seated on a rock. RyAnne gathered the sobbing child into her arms and tucked her head beneath her chin. She glanced around. Where had the guard gone? Maybe this was their chance to escape. Her gaze skimmed the chaos in the river, and for the first time she saw the other slaves from the caravan were also struggling to cross the deep watercourse. But the heavy chains that bound many of them, not only hand and foot, but from one to another, were making it difficult for many to swim. It was a miracle so many had even made it this far, bound as they were. She spotted Usha then, swimming in the center of the pandemonium, helping people across. RyAnne's hopes of escape soared, but then a woman cried out, and her head disappeared beneath the muddy surface of the water. Only a second later she bobbed up again, but from her flailing arms, RyAnne could see she was struggling to remain afloat. She couldn't just run off while other people drowned. She had to help. RyAnne kissed Moyo's head and took her face in her hands. Kalani Pompo! She dipped her chin to make sure her order not to move registered with the little one. Moyo nodded, her wide, tear-filled eyes flitting from one struggling swimmer to the next. As RyAnne dashed back into the waters, she wondered how much the child had seen today. The way she had searched the faces of those who scrabbled their way onto the bank gave RyAnne the distinct impression that she was searching for her mother. What had happened to Nyanja? RyAnne remembered Khalifa's instructions to capture only the healthiest of the villagers. So what had happened to those deemed unfit? A shudder coursed through her, for she knew Khalifa's practice was to leave no survivors. Hopelessness threatened to bring her to collapse right there in the water. Had Moyo witnessed the death of her mother this morning? RyAnne took the arm of the woman struggling to find her footing and tugged her to shallower water. Offering what few words of encouragement she knew in the tribal language, she tugged on the chain to pull the next woman forward as well. She didn't know how long she stood in the shoals, helping people from the muddy water, but when there was finally no one left to assist, she lifted her gaze to the far side of the river to see that night was almost upon them, aided by the clouds of smoke still rising from the dying embers. All along the far embankment, small fires continued to blaze here and there, but even they would soon be out of fuel. She slogged her way back to Moyo and took the little girl's hand to lead her farther from the river. The feel of Moyo's delicate fingers, clasped in hers, returned her thoughts to Nyanja. The resurgence of her anger filled RyAnne with the hope that perhaps Khalifa had been killed in today's melee. And then she immediately felt guilty for wishing the death of anyone, even if it was Khalifa. Even so, she glanced around. She hadn't seen him since they had started running from the fire. Moyo was shivering, and RyAnne realized that a damp chill had sunk into the very core of her own bones as well. Her wet dress was sucking the warmth right out of her. Usha stopped before her and clapped the leg irons around her once more. So much for a chance at escape. With a sigh, RyAnne held out her wrists, but the man stepped back, deliberately stuffed the wrist cuffs back into his back, and then resumed his stoic stance nearby. RyAnne thanked God as she sank down and pulled Moyo onto her lap. Having her hands free would be so helpful in caring for Moyo. She glanced around. She scooted over to put her back to a tree so she could hold Moyo more comfortably. Her leg irons rattled at the movement. Moyo recoiled at the sound. Already the child had come to realize what that clanking represented. Loss of freedom, loss of personhood, loss of hope. All around them, other guards prodded the surviving slaves together and ordered them to sit. And all around them chains rattled as the newly captured slaves complied. Moyo squirmed with each jangle and clank. Shh! RyAnne soothed a hand over the child's back and wrapped her arms tighter, trying to offer as much warmth as she could. A couple of guards set about making fires, and RyAnne was thankful for the relief of the warmth. A loud curse rang out, and Khalifa stormed into the center of the circle. "How many did we lose?" So much for her hopes that he might no longer walk among the living. None of the guards replied, and none of them looked at him. "How many?" Spittle flying, he fisted Usha's tunic into his hand and yanked the men forward. Moyo whimpered, and RyAnne tightened her embrace. Usha mumbled a few words that RyAnne couldn't make out, But Khalifa was apparently very unhappy at the report. He went still. RyAnne felt a prickle along the back of her neck. For it wasn't a calm stillness. It was a stillness fraught with tension, a tension that might explode at any moment. The guard also seemed to hold his breath. And then with a feral yell, Khalifa slugged the man's face. RyAnne flinched at the brutality of it. Usher stumbled back a step and fell to the ground. Khalifa leapt forward and kicked him, fists clenched, tendons in his neck stretched taut, kofia askew. Khalifa bent over the man, screaming and bellowing in a language RyAnne did not know. His face turned red, his eyes bulged. The guard curled his arms over his head and tightened into a ball to protect himself. Temper unabated, Khalifa kicked Usher again. He spat on him, still cursing and screeching, and then he raised one boot and stomped fiercely on the guard's head. RyAnne thrust Moyo to one side and scrambled forward. "Stop!" She tried to insert herself between Khalifa and the prone man, but Khalifa backhanded her out of the way. Her cry of surprise and pain must have somehow penetrated the fog of his rage, because he froze and turned to look at her, a dazed confusion slacking his jaw. The left side of RyAnne's face pulsed with pain. She gingerly felt of her cheek. Her fingers came away bloody. Khalifa blinked. "What have you done?" He was upon her in an instant, taking her face in his hands to angle it toward the firelight and examine her wound. "Stupid woman! This might leave a scar. Good! Let it scar! Let it disfigure me till no one wants to offer you even a penny for me!" She batted his hands away, but he slapped her with an open palm. Her head jolted back, and before she could even gather her wits to continue her fight, he once more took her face firmly in his hands. She met Khalifa's gaze steadily, without flinching, as he prodded and wiped at the wound. "Jabir! I require you, now!" Footsteps scrambled toward them from the other side of the fire, and then a turbaned man with thick, bushy brows and a pointed chin stepped into sight. Khalifa thrust her toward the man, none too gently. "This one is going to need stitches. Make them small and perfect. For after the auction, if I feel I've lost any money on her due to a scar, I'm going to take every penny out of your hide." The man called Jabir bowed, but didn't speak a word. Khalifa stomped off then, and there was suddenly the soft rattle of chains and the release of breaths as everyone around seemed to relax at his departure. Jabir stepped toward her, but RyAnne turned her face away. She pointed to Usher, who remained prostrate, unconscious on the ground. "You don't get to touch me until you have helped that man." Despite the fact that the guard worked for Khalifa, the man had likely saved both her and Moyo's lives today. She wouldn't just stand by and let him die. Jabir glanced at the guard, but then stepped toward her again. He stretched out his hands in a placating way, indicating she should let him treat her first. Why did the man not speak? RyAnne scooted back from him, lifting her chin. "The guard first!" Jabir merely sighed and turned a look on two other guards who stood nearby. Both men stepped over, and each took one of her arms and dragged her over to sit on the rock. One grabbed a handful of her hair and jerked her head back, angling the cut on her face so that Jabir could see it. The other held up a lantern. Calmly, Jabir set to cleaning and examining her wound. Beside them, the unconscious guard moaned. "Well, at least he's alive." RyAnne glowered at the doctor. How could he leave a man so injured to treat a little cut? Usher rolled over to his back with a groan, and RyAnne caught a glimpse of a large gash across his forehead. "He needs help!" Still Jabir spoke not a word. With careful precision, he stitched the short cut on her cheek. His needle was so sharp and thin that RyAnne barely felt the prick each time. After he had finished and given a satisfied nod, he motioned to the two guards who had been holding her to bring Usher and seat him on the rock. RyAnne rose and turned to watch. With each movement he was forced to make, Usher moaned quietly, as though intent on keeping Khalifa from knowing how much pain he had inflicted. Even with one of her eyes swelling shut, RyAnne could see that the man's left arm was broken. White bone protruded through ebony skin. She winced. That would make it all the harder to prevent infection. RyAnne had expected the guards to seat the man on the rock, but instead one knocked him to his knees before it, while the other strode to one of the fires and thrust the flat metal point of his spear into the flames. RyAnne frowned, trying to guess why the healer might require a hot spear for setting an arm. Jabir quickly wrapped the strap of a leather whip around Usher's wrist and stretched his broken arm out over the rock, passing the handle of the quirt to one of the guards. Usher screamed in pain, no longer able to tamp down the expression of his discomfort. One of the guards pulled the arm taut, while the other guard placed his foot just above the elbow. Usher cried out again, but through gritted teeth this time, the sound a reluctant acceptance of what they were about to do. RyAnne felt pity for the man and couldn't help but admire his acquiescence. It was good. Setting his arm would go easier if he tried to relax as they did it. Jabir tied a tourniquet above the guard's elbow. She frowned. What sort of medicine had this man studied? They didn't need a tourniquet for setting an arm. The healer took a step back and then withdrew a large machete from his belt. This he also thrust into the fire, its light reflecting on the grim set of his pointed features. Horror swept through RyAnne. They weren't preparing to set his forearm. They were going to cleave it off and cauterize the stub. Jabir stepped toward Usher. "No!" She threw herself between Jabir and his patient. "It is only broken. It does not need to be amputated." Jabir glowered at her and motioned for her to get out of his way. "Give me a week." RyAnne spread her hands and prayed there was a scrap of decency inside the healer someplace. "Let me treat him. If he's not well on his way to mending within the week, then you can take the arm. Please, just let me try. He saved my life today." Jabir raised the machete a little higher and leaned toward her menacingly. RyAnne swallowed down the tremor of fear that threatened to steal the strength from her knees and lifted her chin. "To get to him, you are going to have to go through me. And what will Khalifa have to say about such further injury to his property?" Jabir grunted, thrust his machete back into its sheath, threw his hands into the air, and stalked away. One of the other two guards cast her a perturbed look, as if she might have just robbed him of his evening's entertainment. He unwrapped the quirt from around Usher's wrist and followed in Jabir's footsteps. The other guard stepped back and folded his arms across his chest, waiting as though he thought she might need his help. A fact for which she was thankful, since she would indeed need him to help her set the bone back into place. "Thank you." She unwrapped the tourniquet and motioned for the guard to hold the lantern so she could see. Though the bone had broken through the skin, it did not appear to be shattered and was not as bad as she'd first feared. She pointed the guard to Usher's arm, just above his elbow. "I need you to hold it tightly, there. See this lump? That is where the bone is separated. We must pull until the bones fit back together." She cast the man a questioning look, and he nodded that he understood. RyAnne squatted down and met Usher's gaze. "This is going to be painful, but if we can do it right, it will save your arm. Bear with me for just a few minutes, yes?" Usher pushed a breath out between pursed lips and nodded. "Very good. Let us begin." RyAnne took hold of the man's wrist while the first guard took hold where she had showed him, just above the elbow. And she pulled with all her might. Her manacles clanked and rattled, and Usher gritted a moan through his teeth, but he did not fight them, and it was only a moment before she felt the bone snap satisfyingly back into place. Panting for breath, RyAnne sank to her knees. She looked at the guard who had helped her. "Thank you. I will need 4 straight sticks the length of his forearm." She indicated the length with her hands, held about a foot apart. "Can you get them for me? And some leather lacing?" With a nod, the guard headed off. The guard who had earlier stalked off with Jabir returned just then, and thrust a small roll of bandages and a pot of hot water into her hands. "From Jabir," he said, and then walked away. Thankful for at least that small blessing, RyAnne set to cleaning the broken skin, and then wrapped the arm with the bandages and tied it off. That, at least, would keep it somewhat clean. RyAnne then turned to the problem of the large gash where Khalifa's boot had split Usher's forehead. Her dress was still wet, and she had no other material, so she used part of her skirt to wipe away some of the blood. She winced. The man needed stitches. When the guard returned with the 4 sticks she'd requested and some leather thongs, she took them up and set to placing them around Usher's arm. She asked the question on her mind. He needs stitches. Would Jabir stitch him as he stitched me? The guard shook his head. As she'd feared, RyAnne tried a different tack. I want to thank you for your help. What is your name? The guard folded his arms and swept her with a suspicious look. But after a moment, he offered.
Jelani.
RyAnne tipped him a nod, as though they might be meeting in any number of normal social settings. And I don't suppose, Jelani, that there's a way for you to fetch me some thread and a needle? Again the man shook his head. Then he strode away, as though his job here were done. RyAnne grimaced. How was she to help Usher without proper medical supplies? She cinched the last of the leather thongs into place around the splints, pleased at least to have that much done. She had just decided that a compress was going to be the best she could offer, and had assisted Usher to a seat with his back to the rock, when Jelani returned. He stretched something out to her, lifting the lantern so she could get a good look at what he held pinched carefully between his fingers. RyAnne's eyes widened. The man held the body of one of the large black pinching ants of the region. RyAnne quaked at the memory of the time she'd stepped into the path of an army of them and gotten a few under her petticoats. The creatures were the length of half her little finger, and just as thick of body, and their pinchers were strong enough to draw blood when they snapped together. Now the guard thrust the lamp into her hands and instructed her to hold it so he could see the cut on Usher's head. He pinched the skin on Usher's forehead together and thrust the head of the ant at the cut. RyAnne winced when the creature clamped its pincers shut on either side of the wound. With a quick twist, Jelani severed the head of the ant from its body, leaving the head with clamped pincers closing the wound. He spread his hands as if he'd single-handedly solved every last one of her problems. He raised his brows, as if asking if she wanted him to find more ants. Despite the churning in her belly at the method of treatment, she had to admit it solved the problem of trying to keep Usher from bleeding throughout the night. Reluctantly, she nodded. We'll need at least 5 more ants. Maybe 6. The guard grinned and headed off to fetch them. RyAnne shuddered. Part 2. Weak light prodded at Trent's eyelids the next morning. With a grunt of pain, he squinted open one eye. The seep of dawn filtered through the branches of the acacia tree they had taken shelter under the evening before, after June had prodded the mangled bullet from his shoulder. Normally he would roll over and go back to sleep, at least until the sun crested the horizon. But today the searing torture pulsing through seemingly every muscle in his body would not release him back to the gentle oblivion of sleep. He sat up slowly, doing his best to withhold the strangulated groan the pain lured from his throat, and failing rather miserably. June was by his side in an instant, urging him to lie back down, but he brushed her aside and propped himself gingerly against the tree trunk. Perhaps he would just sit here for a moment. He didn't think he would make it more than a few steps without some help. Near the fire, Keiko stirred the coals and offered him a grim look of sympathy. Trent ground his teeth. The last thing he wanted was sympathy. Blast his frail flesh for failing him at a time when he needed it to be stalwart and indefatigable. Each moment he sat there like an invalid. RyAnne grew farther and farther away. Why had he not pulled his pistol and used it to defend her? Because there hadn't been time. First the native had been on him before he knew it, and then Khalifa had held the gun to RyAnne's head. These things he knew, but now he wondered if he couldn't have done more. June pressed a cup of hot tea into his hands. Much of the food stores in the village had been destroyed, but Keiko had managed to find a few items that had escaped the worst of the flames, the tea tin among them, and Trent could honestly say that he had never been more happy to see a cup of tea in his entire life. Accepting the cup, he tottered the few steps to the log Keiko had dragged near their fire the night before, barricading a hiss of agony behind his teeth. He huddled into his coat, realizing as the warmth of the fire met his skin that a chill was trembling through him. June gave him a glare and motioned he should return to his pallet. When the cup cradled in his hands blurred around the edges, he assessed that she might be right. But he couldn't just sleep the days away with RyAnne being carted off to who knows where. He had to go after her. He took a sip of the tea, savouring the warmth of it slipping down his throat.
Keiko, I need you to fashion a cart. I have to go after Miss Hunter, but I won't have the strength to travel on my own power for a few days.
June snorted and gave him a look that made it clear he would be indisposed for more than a few days. Keiko only nodded blandly.
I will set about to make this cart, but for a few days you must rest, Missy. Even a cart will be too much for you right now.
Trent sipped more of the tea and pinched his brow.
Missy, wise one.
Somehow he didn't feel very wise today. How had he let Khalifa get the drop on him? He'd known from the moment RyAnne admitted her heritage to the villagers that she'd put herself in grave danger. Yet he'd foolishly let his vigilance go lax, and it might have cost RyAnne everything. Had almost cost him everything. Now he needed to assess his strength. For to come upon Khalifa before he was able to mount a rescue could result in the man gaining the upper hand yet again. Much as he hated to admit it, he did need to rest, at least for today. He offered Keiko a nod of agreement and drained the last of the tea. When he stood, a wave of dizziness washed through him, and he stumbled a sideways step. Keiko leapt to his side and took hold of his arm, guiding him back to his pallet. Okay, maybe he would need more than one day's rest before attempting a rescue. The roaring of a lion woke RyAnne the next morning at dawn. The throbbing in her cheek made her gasp when she sat up. Asha, who was already squatting near a crackling fire just a few paces away, cast her a sympathetic look, obviously in a great deal of discomfort himself. His splintered arm cradled carefully against his chest. He used the long stick in his other hand to prod some of the glowing coals beneath a pot perched on 3 rocks. Moyo lay curled on her side next to RyAnne, her tiny hands tucked beneath her cheek, her soft breaths sonorously sibilant against the backdrop of birdsong and wind-stirred savanna grasses. At the moment, the child looked so peaceful, and yet RyAnne could plainly see the dried, salty tracks her tears had left in the smudges of smoke that coated her chubby cheeks. Long into the night, RyAnne had comforted and shushed the mourning child, until she had finally drifted off, aided by a quiet sonata from RyAnne's violin. If for that reason only, RyAnne was glad she had not chucked the instrument into the fires when she'd been tempted to the day before. The roar of the lion came again, louder. This time it was accompanied by screams, the loud clanking of chains, and the guttural shout of one of the guards. A moment later, the boom of a gun cracked through the dawn prelude. Moyo jolted awake, and RyAnne gathered her into her arms. There came a beat of silence, and then several shrill shrieks pierced the air. Asha leapt to his feet and trotted off, presumably to see what the commotion was about. Moyo buried her face against RyAnne's chest, and a shudder coursed through Moyo's little body. RyAnne's heart plummeted. All of the evening before she had longed to ask the child what she had seen in the village, but she hadn't been able to bring herself to make the child face the terror yet again. But she and Moyo had been kept separate from the rest of the villagers captured, and it was almost more than RyAnne could bear not knowing who had been taken and who had not. Nyanja was ever the one heavy on her heart. Had she been captured? Or would Khalifa have determined her too much of a bother and health risk, since she only had one leg? Considering that he tried to murder her immediately after the loss of her leg, RyAnne feared she knew the answer. Feared she understood what kept the normal chatty child in her arms, so quiet and taciturn. What of June, though, and Keiko, Yanni, and her 2 small children? With each name and face that flitted through her mind, RyAnne's spirit grew heavier and her heart more despondent. Her eyes fell closed. How were they to bear this load? Jesus. Whom shall I send, child? I came. I was reluctant at first, but then I was ready to stay and try to make a difference. Look where that got me. She actually lifted one manacled foot to draw heaven's attention to her chains, as though God didn't already know of her plight. She remembered the Apostle Paul's words in his letter to the Corinthians about how the Lord had denied his request and told him his grace was sufficient for him. RyAnne gritted her teeth. She didn't want sufficient. She wanted rescue. She wanted justice. She wanted retribution. She wanted to turn back the hands of time and walk with Trent along the shores of Lake Nyasa just once more. Instead, doing what she had thought God wanted her to do had brought her here. She had always presumed that if she did what God wanted, it would bring blessing into her life. Peace, comfort, joy, unspeakable. None of those things were hers. More like sorrow, discomfort, and heartache unimaginable. And yet, perhaps this was exactly where God wanted her to be. She opened her eyes, looked around at the trampled grass beneath flat-topped acacia trees. Even though she and Moyo had been kept separate, she knew the many others who had been captured were close by. Was it to them the Lord was asking her to go? The smell of burning porridge wafted to her, and she looked up to see a tendril of black smoke lifting from the pot that Usher had abandoned on the fire. Giving Moyo a quick kiss, RyAnne set her aside and stepped over to the fire, the chains binding one ankle to the other, making even that short distance a mincingly difficult task. The porridge was too thick and charred, but she spooned some out for Moyo nonetheless. Mindlessly, the child scooped the thick mash into her mouth. Her eyes, glassy and vacant. Usher had only been gone for a few minutes, when a loud outcry arose from just beyond the knoll. "Tierney! Tierney! Let's go! Let's go!" The shout carried a hint of panic, as it was repeated over and over by several who RyAnne presumed were guards. RyAnne studied the area to one side of the knoll, and soon a line of slave women shuffled into view. Along either side of the line, several guards swung their arms to crack short whips as they hurried the women along. After the line of women came a line of young girls, and then another of young boys. Each was marched into the center of the encampment. Usher reappeared at her side and thrust her toward Moyo. "Bring the child quickly." RyAnne lurched over and urged Moyo to her feet. "What is happening?" "There has been a lion attack. One of the slaves has been killed." RyAnne barely had time to grab her violin before he shoved them toward the cluster of people. "Everyone together. The lion will not attack again soon. But there is more safety when all are in one place." RyAnne craned her neck to get a better look at the line of women. She recognized two of Chief Banda's wives, women who had given up their hut in order that she and Papa might have a place to stay when they'd first arrived at the village. And then her gaze found Yanni. Quickly she skimmed the rest of the line, but didn't recognize most of them, other than cursorily. She focused on Yanni once more. Yanni returned her look, but there didn't seem to be any life in her eyes. Her newborn was strapped to her back, but another search of the rest of the lines did not reveal the woman's other child, a little girl who had been only a couple years old. Her gaze returned to Yanni's, and the woman gave a slight shake of her head. RyAnne's feet stumbled to a halt as she pressed one hand to her throat and blinked back tears. Usher prodded her from behind. "Keep moving!" RyAnne didn't want to look around after that. She pointed her face toward the ground and kept Moyo tucked close by her side. In her chest, her heart pumped death. Gone, gone. Gone, gone. Gone, gone. Everyone, gone. She hadn't seen Nyanja. She hadn't seen June, nor Keiko, or any other man, for that matter. Where had all the men gone? She heard a distant clanking of chains then, and only a moment later the chain gang of men shuffled into the clearing. One man, the last of the line, was barely able to keep his feet as he stumbled along. And behind him, a pair of empty but bloodied manacles dragged along the ground. Khalifa stormed into the clearing and scanned each group of slaves in a quick assessment before grabbing the nearest guard by one arm, Jelani, who had helped her treat Asha the evening before. "How many did it get?" Khalifa gave the guard a shake. Jelani swallowed. "Just the one. And—" he motioned to the slave at the end of the line of men. "Left another quite injured." RyAnne looked to that man again. At that moment he turned to show Khalifa his injuries. Deep bloody claw marks angled from the man's shoulder, almost all the way to his waist. Khalifa cursed the lion and spun away. "Now that it has a taste of flesh, it will likely stalk us for miles. We must be extra vigilant not to lose any more bucks or does.
I won't have a blasted lion eating my profits. RyAnne blinked. For a moment she'd thought he'd been speaking of a lion attacking antelope, that he was referring to those he had captured like they were nothing better than animals, sent a sick churning through her middle. The man cared nothing about the fact that a person had been killed by the rogue lion, only about the fact that he had lost money because of it. RyAnne lifted her chin and stepped forward. The man will need tending. I can see to his wounds. Khalifa shook his head. No! Even should he recover, he will be too much of a speed liability over the next few days. He snapped his fingers at a guard near the line of men. Dispatch him! And let's be on our way. No! RyAnne gasped, even as the guard lifted his gun and shot the injured man in the head. Oh! She spun away, clasping Moyo to her. Moyo shuddered and pressed her face into RyAnne's skirts. From the line of women a high-pitched wail of total despair pierced the morning. RyAnne too well understood the timbre of the cry. It was as though the woman's soul had burst through a seam in her throat and followed her loved one into the next life. It was the same cry that had been beating for release from her own chest since the moment Trent had fallen to the sand. Had that truly only been yesterday? A great thirst woke Trent that evening, either that or the sound of crying. Crying? He rolled slowly into a sitting position and gingerly swept one hand down his face to clear the clutter of disjointed dreams from his mind. He scrunched his eyes tight, and then stretched them wide open, willing them to grow accustomed to the evening light. And then he held his breath and listened. Yes, crying. Neither Keiko nor June were in sight, but the crying was too delicate to be either of them. It was coming from a child. Gritting his teeth in preparation for the shards of pain, Trent slowly tottered to his feet. He supposed it fell to him to find the child and see if he could help. But just as he started to shuffle a few steps toward the sound, Keiko emerged into the clearing by the fire with a little girl in his arms. Relief swept over Trent. Nimbo. Her snuffling increased anew as she lurched from Keiko's arms and launched herself against Trent's legs to wrap frail arms about him. Whoa there! Trent flapped his arms. Keiko shot out one of his hands and captured a handful of Trent's shirt front. Trent would have gone over backward if not for Keiko's lightning-fast reflexes. Keiko grinned at him as he pried the child's arms from around Trent's legs and then squatted in front of her. He spoke in the girl's Chewa language. We must be careful with Mizi. He has been injured and requires time to heal. Niimbo bounced Trent a terrified look. Keiko roughed a hand over the nap of her hair. Don't worry. He's much too stubborn to let a mere bullet bring about his end. A tearful smile of relief peeked through. Trent nodded reassurance at the girl and then asked Keiko, Where did you find her? Keiko handed the girl a guava from the small basket of food near the fire. He stood, folding his arms, looking more weary and worn down than he ever had since Trent had known him. I've been... His jaw bunched and he bent and plucked a blade of grass. All day, I have been digging graves and burying my father's people. He swallowed visibly. And my father. Trent reached out one hand and clapped the man on his shoulder. I'm sorry. Chief Banda had likely been killed so that he couldn't urge his people to rebellion on the long journey to the coastal city, where the slaves would be auctioned off. From this region, that was likely Bagamoyo. Keiko remained dry-eyed and brushed the sympathy away, as was the custom of the men of his tribe. No more would be said of his father until he was ready. The child was captured along with Moyo, but she says the Arab in charge took only Moyo, and as he left, commanded his guard to kill Niimbo. The guard shot into the ground, and then instructed her to run and hide. She did, and remained there quietly until fear and hunger overwhelmed her. I found her only a few minutes ago. Trent gritted his teeth. He turned to study the child who had gobbled down the guava and now lay curled atop his bedding, with her hands tucked beneath her cheek. She was already sound asleep. The man is a devil. Keiko nodded his head. Indeed. The simple agreement carried with it a whirl of grief and despondency.
June returned from foraging through the remains of the village and nearby gardens for what food and supplies she could find. Keiko was not in sight, but the captain was on his feet near the fire, and the sight filled her with relief. This was good. She nodded her head in satisfaction. The captain would go after Miss RyAnne and rescue her from the terrible slavers. June's search for food had turned up only a few potatoes, 1 corn stalk with 2 small ears of corn, and a clay pot that had somehow been spared destruction during the sacking of the village. Today she had managed to net 1 decent-sized fish, but if they moved away from the lake, what would they do for food on the morrow? She sighed. Bad news they had plenty of, so she would try to be thankful to see the captain on his feet, and for the fact that many fruits were in season this month. Giving the captain a nod of greeting, she bent down on her knees near the fire pit and leaned close to the coals to blow on them. They would need the fire built up to cook the few bits of food she'd found today. She fed in a few twigs from the pile nearby, and was glad when they easily caught flame. She added a few stouter sticks and then sat back on her ankles. That was when she noticed the child lying on the captain's blanket. She gasped, and a thrill of happiness coursed through her, but her relief sapped all her strength. She remained where she was. Besides, exuberance would do no one any good. She darted the captain a questioning look. He swayed slightly on his feet. Keiko found her and brought her in a few minutes ago. Niimbo was sleeping soundly on the only bedding they had, and the captain looked about done in. He needed to lie back down. She gestured to the child. "I will move her." She started to rise, but the captain swiped away the suggestion with one hand. "No, she needs the rest more than I do." June doubted the truth of that. The man's colour was not much better than that of his tattered shirt. "At least sit, Missy." He complied, sinking rather clumsily onto the log Keiko had dragged near the fire. Half keeping an eye on him and half watching the sleeping child, June worked at creating a fish stew with the potatoes and corn and fish. The water hadn't even started to boil yet when the captain slumped forward. "Missy!" She lurched toward him and grabbed his shoulder just before he slumped all the way forward and fell into the fire. She pulled him backward off the log, away from the flames. The man trembled all over. He should not have left his bed. She needed to move the girl and get him back onto his blanket. That would at least keep most of the dirt out of his wounds. Dr. Hunter had told her that dirt in wounds was a bad thing. The captain's trembling ceased, and his body went completely limp and still. Let it not be! She placed her hand under his nose to see if he was breathing. At first she felt nothing. Her pulse pounded harder. She tilted her head, kept her hand there, and willed the man to breathe. Finally, she felt the faintest puff of air against her hand. Keiko stepped back into the clearing just then. June scrambled to her feet and kept her eyes trained near Keiko's feet, as was respectful of the man who was their tribe's new chief. "The captain has collapsed. I think it is best if we move the child and return him to the blanket." Keiko hoisted a single piece of canvas into her line of sight. "I found this today. The child can sleep on this. Lay it out, and I will fetch her." June dipped her knees and clapped her hands in acknowledgement of his suggestion. Then she took the canvas from him and settled it over the pile of dried bamboo leaves she had slept on the night before. It was only a moment before Keiko brought the child over and laid her down. And then together they worked to lift the captain and half drag, half carry him to his pallet. Bright new blood seeped into the shoulder of his shirt. And when June lifted the bandage to see if there was something she might do, the stench of infection greeted her. She clucked and fussed over the wound, trying to clean it, as Dr. Hunter had shown her a few times in his clinic. But she knew it was pointless. Never had she seen someone with a wound this infected recover. Keiko waited quietly nearby. She knew he was waiting to hear her assessment. Her gaze flicked up to his just for a moment before she remembered he was now the chief, and she pulled it into proper obedient subservience. "I fear the captain will not be long with us." Keiko turned from her, propped his hands on his hips, and tipped his face to the sky. But after only a moment he spun back to face her. "Wake the child. We must pray to the Great Spirit of the English. He's the only one who can save him now." June bent her knees and clapped her hands. She woke Niimbo, and the three of them knelt beside the captain, as they'd often seen Dr. Hunter do when he beseeched his god. They folded their hands and bowed their heads. June stared down at the place where a breeze ruffled the captain's shirt and waited for Keiko to begin to speak. Keiko shuffled back and forth on his knees for a moment, then cleared his throat.
June, say the prayer.
June felt her eyes widen. What if she said the words wrong? She thought back. Had there been any special way Dr. Hunter prayed each time? She didn't think so. She remembered the talk she and Miss RyAnne had shared on the beach when Miss RyAnne had told her that the English God could be her God too. Miss RyAnne had not said they needed to do anything special, just believe as the doctor had spoken of in his message. She cleared her throat. Great Spirit of the English, we know we are not English, but today we are not here for ourselves. We are here for this man who is yours already. Keiko nudged her. June debated between offending the spirit she was talking to or offending her chief. Keiko nudged her again. June decided that offending the chief kneeling by her side was probably more dangerous than offending the spirit she could not see. She glanced over at Keiko. His expression held apology.
Perhaps, like a chief, the spirit will not hear the case of anyone who is not his.
June shrugged.
How should I know?
Niimbo yawned sleepily. Keiko rubbed both hands down his face and then back over his hair to clasp them behind his neck. He glanced down at the captain, whose chest was barely rising and falling.
Great chiefs like to receive great gifts. I think to be safe, we need a gift to offer this spirit.
June pondered that.
Just before Dr. Hunter died, Miss Hunter did tell me that this god could be ours too. Nyanja seemed to believe it. I was not so sure, but you might be right. So how do we ensure this spirit will listen to us? Chiefs will only hear the cases of people from their own villages, and they expect large bounty before they grant new people admittance into their villages.
June thought back.
The doctor said in his chapel that last morning that the son of this spirit came down to earth and died.
Keiko made a noise of disgust and started to climb to his feet.
How can a god who let his son die be of any help to us, then?
June captured his arm before he could tromp away.
But then the son came back to life again, and that makes him very powerful, yes?
Keiko sank back to his knees between her and Niimbo.
If it is true, I suppose it does. So what gift do we offer?
Niimbo tugged on Keiko's arm.
A servant is a big gift, she said. You can tell this spirit that I will be his servant if he will heal my friend.
June nodded.
We should all say that. Flattery might help also. So we should tell him that we've heard of his great power, and that we all want to be his servants. Yes.
Keiko nudged her, and a gleam of triumph spread across his face.
And if he wants us to be his servants, he needs to use some of his power to heal our friend.
June folded her hands again, as she'd seen the doctor do.
Fine. But if you want to barter with him, then you need to pray to him yourself. Bartering with a spirit does not seem so wise. All great chiefs love a good barter.
June only offered a skeptical look as response. Keiko threw up his hands.
Fine. Pray to him your way, then. But don't blame me if the captain dies.
Satisfied, June tried her prayer again.
Great Spirit of the English, it has been told to me that you will be our spirit too if we choose you. We have heard of your great power, and we have agreed that we will all be your servants. And Keiko wants me to say that if you accept our offer of service, you will please use some of your power to heal our friend, the captain.
She paused. There was some way the doctor had always ended his prayers, but she could not remember the words. So she finished with,
That is all. Thank you.
They all stood, and Niimbo rubbed her eyes sleepily.
How does one go about being a servant to a spirit?
June looked at Keiko. He shrugged. June nudged Niimbo into a seat on the log near the fire.
Perhaps the captain can tell us that if he gets better.
Niimbo looked sadly toward the captain.
Do you think the spirit knows we are serious? I want the captain to get better.
June touched the child's head, and then set the fish stew away from the fire. It would need to cool for some time before they could eat it with their fingers.
Spirits know much more than we, Niimbo. I'm sure this spirit does also.
For days they marched. 2 weeks ago, after the caravan stopped one evening, Jabir had come by and removed her stitches. He'd studied the cut on her face, and then grunted in satisfaction and stalked away. He hadn't bothered even once to examine Asha. But thankfully, the man seemed to be well on his way to recovery. Today the sun beat down with such merciless heat that RyAnne could see the shimmer of its fervour cavorting on the horizon. As if to taunt her, sweat poured from her until everything from her hair to the hem of her skirts felt limp with the dampness of it. And still the march continued. The manacles around her ankles chafed persistently, and today a large blister had burst open. After so many days of walking, she had assumed her body would eventually grow used to the strenuous task required of it. But today, when the call had gone out for the evening's rest, she'd never felt more relieved to be able to collapse to the ground. Moyo did the same, and promptly fell asleep. RyAnne took off her boot and examined the large oozing blister. Infection would set in if she didn't care for it, but she knew that asking for medical supplies would only be greeted with a grunt of cynical laughter. With a sigh, she tore off part of her petticoat, soaked it with a bit of the water from the creek they had settled near tonight, and wrapped it around the wound. Hopefully, that would keep it clean and keep her from getting an infection. It felt a little better after the initial sting of the cool water. Even so, she dreaded tomorrow's long day of walking. It would be compounded by Moyo's weight, because her little legs simply couldn't keep up with the grueling pace Khalifa had set for them. RyAnne knew she would be carrying the child for much of the trek to the coast. Asha stepped into the light of the fire he'd made for her and Moyo earlier. It had become quite clear that Khalifa had assigned Asha to keep her and Moyo separate from the other slaves. They were treated with more care than the others, fed more and given bedding to separate them from the cold ground each night. Asha had even packed Moyo on his back for several hours today, but only after RyAnne had fallen when her foot slipped into a rut on the trail. Each evening when RyAnne curled into her blankets, she heard the rattle of chains as the rest of the captured settled onto the cold ground, and guilt pricked at her. But for Moyo's sake, she was thankful for the small luxuries they were given. For despite the heat of the days, the nights were quite cool. Cool enough that she often woke with cramped muscles that had tightened against the invasion of the chill. Moyo had taken to curling up against her for the past several nights. That had helped Moyo, at least, to sleep a little better. For RyAnne's part, she hadn't slept well for weeks now. For every time she closed her eyes, she saw the face of the captain. She saw the quirk of his brow, or pulse of his jaw when he'd been frustrated with her. She saw the exasperated expression of the valiant hero who had come to her rescue more times than she could count. She saw the soft eyes of the man who had consoled and comforted her after Papa's passing. She saw the gentle crooked smile that had touched his lips just before he kissed her that last day. And always, always, the last thing she saw was the blood blooming on the front of his shirt after Khalifa shot him. Now, Asha held out 2 balls to her and indicated Moyo with a dip of his head. "Wake her. She must eat." RyAnne accepted the food and set it on a rock next to her. "I will. If you want, I can look at the cut on your head." He brushed her concern aside.
"It heals well."
"And your arm?" She was thankful to see the man still wore the splints, as she'd requested. He lifted it.
"The pain is much less now."
His gaze darted across the encampment to where she could see Jabir smoothing a salve on the whip lashings of one of the other slaves. Jabir's act almost looked compassionate if she hadn't known it for what it was. Simply keeping Khalifa's investment healthy. She returned her attention to Asha. Why does the healer never speak? Asha gave her a sharp look and then transferred his attention back to the healer. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then finally he said,
2 years passed. Jabir voiced disagreement with Khalifa over the way he was treating the slaves. Khalifa cut out his tongue.
with a gasp, RyAnne raised one hand to her mouth. She swallowed down the bile at the back of her throat. Why would he still work for a man who did something like that to him? Asha blinked. You do not know. He is Khalifa's slave, as am I. We do the bidding of our master. RyAnne's gaze returned to Jabir, but this time she saw the man in a new light. I'm sorry. I did not know. Asha made no response other than to pluck a round blade of grass and roll it between his lips. RyAnne moved the conversation back to a safer topic with a gesture to Asha's splintered arm. I'm glad the pain is less. Asha only grunted with a nod of thanks. Willing away the depressing thoughts about just how deep the scars of slavery ran through the world, she scooted over next to Moyo. She touched the girl's shoulder. Moyo, I have food. While Moyo ate, RyAnne prepared her palate, and Moyo had just settled back to sleep when in the far distance a lion roared. Asha's brow puckered, and he tilted his head to listen to the sounds more carefully for a moment. With a flick of his tongue, he tucked the stem of grass into the corner of his lips. It stalks us. RyAnne nodded, a tingle of horror creeping across her scalp. For the past several nights they'd heard the creature. Each night it seemed to grow closer, bolder. She didn't want to dwell on it. How long until we meet up with the next caravan? Asha shrugged as he settled down against the base of the acacia tree, tipped his head against it, and shut his eyes. Soon. RyAnne would have liked to have drifted off to sleep right away, but her mind wouldn't let go of the thoughts tumbling about. Asha and Jabir, slaves themselves. Surely they understood better than most the horrors of what they were inflicting, and yet they were forced to help their master make slaves of others. Khalifa was a terrible man, yes, but she had no doubt that he was just a garden-variety slave runner. All up and down the eastern coast of Africa, men just like him plundered and spoiled and pillaged. Tears slipped from the outer corners of her eyes and ran back into her hair. Back at the village, she'd had the lofty thought that staying there and helping the villagers might make some sort of impact on slavery. She'd even told June and Nyanja that her grandmother had been a woman from their tribe, thinking to help them see that the color of their skin did not have to hold them back from anything. Not a relationship with God, not education, not happiness. What a fool she'd been to think she could make a difference. In fact, if Khalifa could be trusted, that very admittance was what had caused the village to be plundered in the first place. Her attempts to help had only made things worse. If she had just stayed out of it, gone back to Zanzibar with the captain when he'd asked her to, none of this would have happened. Trent would still be alive. The village would still be intact. She wouldn't be bound in chains and headed for an uncertain future. And yet, hadn't the upper echelons of society's propensity to stay out of it been the very foundation stone upon which today's rampant slavery had been built? She thought again of the question that kept rising from the moment she'd walked the gangway up to the Wasp, and remembered her earlier thought that perhaps this was exactly where God wanted her to be. Yet what could she do here that might make a difference for poor people like those lying in chains all around her? So many questions. Questions she had no answers for. She pinched the bridge of her nose and closed her eyes, willing the tears to remain at bay. Father, I don't understand. Please, make it clear to me what you are asking of me. I'm tired, so tired of fighting for my own way. A thought jolted through her. What was she thinking? She had lost all freedom to make her own decisions, and if she was tired of fighting for her own way, she was certainly in the right place. Because nothing was going her way. That would be even more compounded once she was sold as a slave. So who was she to think that God wanted anything from her at all? Perhaps she'd only been fooling herself into thinking he had plans for her. She scrunched her eyes shut. No. She wouldn't let this trial steer her faith. Hadn't Christ himself faced the trial of the cross? She opened her eyes and studied the stars above. Yes, God had a plan for her, and apparently this journey was a part of it. So for now, she would just have to keep on trusting and trying to help those around her as best she could. Her thoughts turned to Mother. Papa had asked her to forgive Mother, to try to understand what had driven her spitefulness over all these years. And now she might never see her again. Father, help her to know that I forgive her. The tears did come then, slipping back into the hair at her temples, as she studied the moisture-distorted stars spangled across the velvety blackness of the heavens. If she could just see Mother one last time, she would tell her how utterly sorry she was for the pain her presence had brought each time Mother looked at her. Part 3. Usher soon turned out to be 5 days. They came upon the larger caravan, mid-afternoon on a sticky, humid day that had kept RyAnne busy swiping at her brow to keep the sting of sweat from trickling into her eyes. Exhaustion clung like a heavy burden. This was multiplied as they crested the top of a hill and caught sight of the vast stretch of valley teeming with long lines of people chained together, most of them packing a tusk of ivory on their heads. The adults she had expected, but it was the vast amount of children that stole her ability to put one foot in front of the other. Usher prodded her from behind.
No resting yet. We must reach the valley.
He tossed a glance behind them, and RyAnne recognized his concern over the rogue lion. As they descended the trail into the valley, RyAnne couldn't help but voice her shock. So many children, Usher. So many boys. He turned his gaze to the valley, let it linger. His lips pressed together grimly.
They will be made into eunuchs, sent to the palaces of the East.
But that's illegal. He gave her a look, eyes narrowed to point out her naivete. RyAnne swallowed and returned her focus to the valley. This was what Trent had been searching for, evidence that Khalifa was involved in illegal activity, and if so, whom he worked for. She clenched her teeth. Trent was no longer able to carry out that mission, but maybe she could find out more and somehow get a message to Commodore Cornwall. Usher, you must let me sleep near the children tonight. Some of them may need medical care. He nudged her forward.
I must do nothing. And you should not get close to the children. 9 out of every 10 of those boys will die from castration.
RyAnne gasped. Surely he exaggerated? How did you come to be the slave of such a man, Usher? He swept a hand down his face, and a look filled with so much emotion crossed his expression that she felt the impact of it.
I was one of the boys who lived.
The port of Mombasa bustled with activity as stevedores unloaded a fleet of ships recently in from India. The scents of curry and sandalwood mingled with other not-so-pleasant odours common to any port city. Sewage, bilge water, and decaying wharfs. Along the beach, a string of camels being loaded with supplies bellowed and grunted their displeasure, while men alternately yelled and prodded or cajoled the beasts to cooperate. In the dark hull of one of the ships, Hakim Chadha hefted another crate of spices and thanked the gods he'd been assigned this task, instead of the one of sluicing down the last slave ship that had docked. He emerged on the deck and made his way toward the gangway, but Anjou, the stevedore ahead of him, had stopped and was staring out to sea. Hakim adjusted his hold on his crate and looked to see what had caught Anjou's attention. A galleon flying a British flag tacked toward the wharf, a sight not strange in and of itself. It was the speed at which it approached that was strange. Anjou glanced over.
It comes with too much speed, yes?
Hakim swallowed as he nodded. He assessed their position in relation to where the ship was going to crash.
Clear the docks, he yelled to those below.
Boatmen, porters, and hawkers carried on about their business. Hakim dropped his crate and ran to the ship's rail.
Clear the docks! You there! Move!
The turbaned sailor glanced up. His eyes grew round as he screeched warnings to those nearby and scrambled to escape the quickly looming disaster. The ship ploughed into the docks, sending wood crates and men flying in all directions. The ship Hakim and Anjou stood on shook violently and heaved on the waves, but thankfully the ties stuck fast. The British galleon now had a gaping hole in its hull and was rapidly taking on water. Simultaneously, Hakim and Anjou rushed toward the injured ship. They were halfway down the gangplank of their own ship when, from the pilot house of the other, a man stumbled to the rail. Even from this distance, Hakim could see that his face was grey and pasty with sweat. The man leaned on the rail for a moment, and then he collapsed, slipping out of sight behind the gunwale. He was dead by the time Hakim and Anjou reached the deck. Had the choice been left to Hakim, he would have tugged the galleon out into the water and set the ship afire. But the choice was not his. Seeing as how there wasn't a living soul left aboard the ship, the portmaster claimed the contents of its hold as recompense for damages to his wharf. He set several men to unloading the galleon, while others were immediately dispatched to fetch new lumber for the repairs that would be needed. Hakim once again thanked the gods that he'd drawn lumber duty. He didn't get paid enough to have to deal with dead bodies, especially ones that stank as badly as a few of the corpses aboard the galleon. The last man alive had obviously been weakened enough by the sickness that he couldn't hoist the corpses overboard. Hakim was even more thankful that he'd been sent off on lumber duty when, 3 days after the unloading of the galleon, the first of the dock workers assigned to the task fell ill. When the man died 2 days after that, Hakim packed up his rucksack and hired aboard the first ship that would take him. It was headed to Zanzibar with the morning's tide. Good enough. Life was too short for him to stick around this cursed port. He would have one last drink with his comrades, and then he would move on to bigger and better things. Hakim found them at their regular alehouse and sank down at the table with them, ordering a draught. Little did he know that the keg he was served from had only last week arrived in port aboard the British galleon. Trent awoke with a groan. So much pain. He didn't dare open his eyes yet. First he must assess. Remember. Where was he? What had happened? Everything seemed to be moving, and he just wanted it to be still. To let him rest. There was a repetitive squeak, 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 and heat. So much heat. His head lolled first to one side, then to the other, and a jostle of whatever bed he was lying on zinged pain through his shoulder and forced a gasp from his lips. The jostling stopped, and suddenly blaring sunlight hit his face. Even though his eyes were still closed, the light made him scrunch them tighter and lift a hand as a shield. A moment later, a deeper shadow settled above him. Slowly Trent squinted open one eye. A worried face hovered above his own. Trent tried to say, "Keiko, is that you?" But he feared it came out more like a garbled moan. "The god you serve has saved you, then?" Keiko poked him in the chest. A quick jab, almost as though he half expected Trent to be a spirit being. "Ow!" With a gasp, Keiko leapt back. The sun slammed into Trent's eyes once more. "Ah!" Trent winced and covered his face with both hands. This lying on his back with the sun blazing directly above him was no good. He'd be blind as well as half dead if he didn't find the strength to sit up soon. Why ever was Keiko acting so strangely? Trent stretched out one hand. "Keiko, help me sit up, please." "He has saved you." Keiko took his hand and gently pulled him into a sitting position. Trent didn't have the gumption to try and decipher Keiko's strange behavior. His tongue felt like a stick in his mouth. "Water, please." He pried his eyes barely open, wanting to give himself time to adjust to the bright sunlight. He wasn't sure why the light would be so bright. The last thing he remembered. What was the last thing he remembered? Niimbo had been on his bedroll. He'd been sitting by the fire. Keiko pressed an open canteen into Trent's hands. "We have been travelling for days, Missy. We thought we had lost you." Trent pondered on that while he lifted the canteen to his lips. His hand trembled. Since when had a canteen grown so heavy? His eyes were more accustomed to the light now, and he glanced around them. They were not in their encampment back under the trees by the village. He took another swallow from the canteen, savouring the liquid as it spread over his tongue despite the warmness of it. After a moment he pegged Keiko with a look and realized that June and Niimbo were standing on either side of him. All three of them had eyes nearly as wide as the mouth of the canteen in his hands.
"We are not at our camp," he frowned.
It wasn't like him to so blatantly state the obvious. He tried again.
"Where are we?"
June clapped both hands to her mouth, and a look of glee filled her eyes. "He lives!" she exclaimed. Trent actually tossed a glance over his shoulder to see if she might be talking about someone else, but no. It was apparent her comments were made with regard to him.
"What happened?"
Niimbo threw both her small hands into the air and danced a little jig as she spun in a circle. "He lives! He lives! He lives!" she shouted, hips swaying and knees protruding at odd angles. With a degree of frustration, Trent tamped home the cork of the canteen.
"Yes, I live. Now if one of you could be so kind as to fill me in on where we are and why you are so happy to see me alive, I would greatly appreciate it."
Silence and wide eyes were all the answer he received. Realizing his strength was fading quickly, he gave up and plunked the canteen down on the wooden board that had apparently been his bed for the past few days. He eased back onto his elbows and studied the contraption he was lying on. It was a rickshaw of sorts with a tented frame above it. Tied over the frame was a somewhat burnt about the edges piece of canvas. It had several charred holes in it, but had apparently been his shelter from the sun, as they'd been travelling. He gave his head a little shake, trying to dislodge any memories of the past few days from the depths of his mind, but all he could conjure was blankness.
So weak.
He let himself collapse all the way back to a prone position, no longer even caring about the sun in his face. He heard some bustling about, and then blessed shade covered him. But June crawled up onto the plank beside him. She jostled his shoulder.
"Before you sleep, Missy, you must eat a little. For days you had nothing but a little broth dribbled between your lips. Too tired, June."
He tried to brush her away.
"Only a few bites. Then I will leave you to sleep again."
She nudged his lips with a wooden spoon, and he tasted the bland cornmeal mush that was a breakfast staple in these parts. If only to get her to leave him alone, he took the first mouthful. But then it was as if his body realized its need for sustenance, for he greedily slurped the next spoonfuls that she offered him.
"Not too much. Here, have more water."
June held the canteen for him this time, and he drank several more swallows. She said something else to him, but the black tug of sleep had already too far encroached for him to make sense of her words. The next time Trent awoke, he was cognizant of only one thing. He couldn't fellowship with his own odor for even one more minute. He needed a bath, and he needed it now. The cart wasn't moving, and the air felt comparatively cool, though he could see it was still light outside, the charred canvas covering.
"Keiko?"
The flap of canvas flipped back, but it was Niimbo's face that peered in at him.
"Keiko."
He gestured for the child to go get him. She only shook her head.
"June, then?"
Niimbo shook her head again. Trent frowned and struggled to sit up. The effort took all of his strength, and he was puffing for air by the time he got his spine straight. The cart was parked beneath a lone acacia tree in the middle of a vast plain of brown savanna. Whatever direction he looked, north, south, east, or west, there lay nothing but sepia swaying grasses. But there to the south he could see a dip in the grassland, and now that he could see it, he also heard the dulcet trickle of water.
Blessed water! Perhaps God yet remained on his throne.
The irreverent thought brought an immediate prick of conscience. He angled a glance toward the heavens.
Forgive me, Father, but I think even you would admit that my circumstances of late haven't offered the best proof that you watch over the righteous and promise to bring about the destruction of the wicked, aye?
He judged the distance between himself and the stream, considered how much strength it had taken for him just to sit up, and realized the water was too far for him to make it there and back again. Niimbo stirred something over a small fire not too far distant.
Where are they?
He called to her. She looked up, shrugged, then chattered something in her native Chewa, spoken too quickly for him to grasp. He caught Keiko and June, but couldn't decipher anything until she said, Miss Hunter. A sheer jolt of energy infused him. Had they caught up to the slave caravan? How many days had he been slipping in and out of consciousness while they travelled? He glanced around again as he tested his ability to move his injured shoulder. There was still pain when he moved the limb, but nothing like it had been at first. With time and continued limbering by movement, the shoulder would be next to new again. Movement caught his eye. Several miles to the north he could see two people picking their way through the grass. June and Keiko were returning. So whatever news the child had just been chattering, he would soon have it from Keiko himself. Niimbo brought him a bowl of thin stew. There wasn't much in it but broth, but he used his own hand, shaky though it was, to spoon the sustenance into his mouth, and was thankful for the bolstering of it. He had just finished when Keiko and June stopped next to the cart. June's smile stretched like a white moon across her face. "You have come back to us from the very teeth of death." Trent returned her smile and tried not to feel too keenly the pain pulsing through his newly worked shoulder.
That feels about right.
He handed his empty bowl and the wooden spoon to Niimbo, with a nod of thanks, then took in Keiko's grim expression.
"What do you find?"
He pointed with his chin in the direction they had just been. Keiko and June exchanged a glance. Keiko's words were measured when he said,
"Less than half a day's journey to the north and east, we have come across a wide trampled path, made by many people."
That had to be the slave caravan. But Trent's strength was nowhere close to what it needed to be to win out in a confrontation with Khalifa.
"How far behind them are we?"
Keiko shrugged.
"Perhaps 8 suns, but they seem to be moving fast. So it may be a few more. 8 days. Much too long."
And yet when he assessed his injuries, not nearly long enough. And then there was the other looming dilemma they were up against.
"How many days until they reach Bagamoyo?"
Keiko looked grim.
"I spoke to a man once who told me of this trail to Bagamoyo. He described that mountain there, the one with the smoke coming out of the top."
Trent glanced over at the small volcanic mound wisping steam into the sky.
"Yes, and?" "He told me that from here, it was less than 10 moons to Bagamoyo."
Terror clambered through Trent's chest. They must mount their rescue before the caravan reached the town, for there would be too many in Bagamoyo who would side with the slavers, no matter that RyAnne was more white than black, or that most of the other slaves had neither been at war nor part of a raiding party when captured. Trent's heart thudded in his chest. Less than a week and he might be able to pull RyAnne into his arms once more, or he would lose her forever.
"We must reach them before they get to Bagamoyo. We must travel a little further than normal each day, and I must exercise and begin to get my strength back. We can also travel for a portion of the cooler nights."
Keiko shook his head.
"That would be most unwise, Missy. I found the carcass of one who had been attacked by a lion, and our party is small."
Trent swallowed. A rogue lion would definitely be a reason to stay in camp, close to a blazing fire each night. He slammed his palm against the wood of the rickshaw. Could nothing go his way lately? He sighed. There was naught for it but to press on, and pray he wasn't too late to save her. He nodded to Keiko.
"Fine. Right. We should not travel at night in that case. But let's try to make the best time we can during the days. For now, help me."
He motioned to the stream bed.
"I intend to rid myself of this deathbed stench."
Keiko, June, and Niimbo were all staring at Trent when he awoke the next morning. He blinked sleepily and scrubbed one hand over his face, hating the itch of the several weeks-old beard. He sat up, finding that after having eaten the nourishing stew the evening before, he was much better able to handle that task this morning. Still the three of them stared at him. Trent lifted a hand of question.
"What can I do for you?"
3 pairs of feet shuffled, and June and Niimbo turned their focus onto Keiko. Keiko cleared his throat.
"You must tell us what we have to do, as servants of your great spirit."
Trent's brows lifted.
"Truly?"
Wouldn't Dr. Hunter be overjoyed if he could hear this conversation? How many times had they sat about the fire on their way inland to Keiko's village with Dr. Hunter expounding on the truths of the scriptures to the men travelling with them? Yet none of them had ever shown the slightest inclination of turning from their traditions. Yet now this. Keiko rubbed the back of his neck, seemingly a bit uncomfortable with the subject.
When you lay dying, we promised your Great Spirit that we would become his servants if he would use his powers to save you. As you can see,
Keiko swept a gesture the length of Trent's body.
You appear to have been saved. Thus, we too must hold up our end of the bargain.
Trent grinned.
I see. Well, I can tell you that it gives me a great thrill to hear you say it. But if we are going to engage in such a theological discussion, first I'm going to need a cup of tea. Aye?
Nyimbo scrambled to fetch the gourd they'd been using to drink from. She dipped it into the steaming pot over the fire and hurried to his side with the drink. Trent sipped, relishing the feel of the hot liquid sliding down his throat.
Very good. Thank you. All right. How about we get on our way and I will tell you of my God as we travel?
And perhaps that would keep him from worrying so much about whether he was going to arrive in time to save RyAnne from being sold and shipped off. It was agreed upon, and it only took them a moment to gather their meagre supplies and head down the trail. From his position sitting on the board of the rickshaw, Trent said,
Let's begin at the beginning.
All that day, as they followed the wide, trampled swath of grassland leading toward the coast, he told them of creation, of Adam and Eve, that God created them because he wanted to have fellowship with mankind, of how the devil deceived them and how they sinned and were removed from paradise, and their relationship with God was broken. He told them of Cain killing his brother Abel, of Noah and the flood. Keiko voiced the opinion that perhaps there should be another flood to wipe the evil slavers off the face of the earth. So Trent explained that the rainbows that could be seen in the sky of a time were a symbol of God's promise that he would never again flood the earth. They stopped for a short time at noon to eat and refill their canteens from a small stream. While they ate, Trent told of Abraham and Sarah, and of the promised child, Isaac, whose name meant laughter, and who would be the seed from which a whole nation would spring. When they started on their way again, he walked for a bit. This time he told them of Joseph and his brothers, of Moses and how his people were enslaved in Egypt by Pharaoh. Partway through that story, June tisked in disgust that this new spirit they were planning to serve had let his people become enslaved. But when Trent got to the part about the plagues and Pharaoh's army drowning in the Red Sea, she lost her recalcitrance and opined that perhaps this spirit would be worth serving after all. By the time he made it to David's fight with the giant Goliath, his voice was giving out, and it was time to make camp for the night.
I will tell you more of my God and his people tomorrow, he said.
And he did. All that week as they travelled, he walked them through the scriptures, through Jesus' death on the cross and subsequent resurrection, and on into the book of Revelation, which promised all mankind would one day stand before God, some to live in heaven, and some to face eternal damnation. All three listened intently. Nyimbo seemed ready to believe anything he said, a fact that made Trent all the more careful with his word choices. But the stubborn logic he kept bumping up against from Keiko and June was the fact that there were many spirits in many places, all of which men had to be mindful to please. And it was a weary lot indeed for people to try and keep all the spirits appeased. Finally, in frustration at the fire one night, Trent threw up his hands.
Look at me. I am well and whole. I even walked for several hours today. Have any of the spirits you have known before this one done such a thing for you as to bring a man back from the very brink of death?
June pierced Keiko with a look. Never have I seen a man as sick as he was, live to tell about it. Keiko begrudgingly agreed. At last, perhaps they were getting somewhere. Trent lowered his hands with a breath of relief.
That's because there is only one God. He is above all other spirits, of which there are many, to be sure, but we do not have to fear them, since we serve the one who rules them all. The one, in fact, who created them all.
This logic seemed to satisfy, and they were less resistant to the truths of the scriptures after that. RyAnne woke while it was still dark, and lay in the night silence, listening to Moyo's soft breaths on the thin blanket beside her, The day they had crested the hill and seen the large caravan stretched out in the valley below them seemed so long ago now. For many days already they had been travelling with the much larger caravan. RyAnne and Moyo had been segregated from the main group once again, but this time there were other women with them. Each of these women had some special feature that made her physically attractive and thus worth more on the market. Some were of mixed blood, like RyAnne and Moyo. Others simply had striking features that set them apart from the rest. But all of them would likely be sold as concubines to the palaces of the East, RyAnne had learned. Fear quaking through her, RyAnne settled one hand over Moyo's little head. What did the future hold for this little one, whose father was so calloused as to sell her? She trembled, as she did every time she thought about the future. Just as before, they continued to receive special treatment. They were fed twice a day instead of only once, and their guards stopped to water them every 2 hours, where the others only got water 3 times a day, despite the merciless heat of an uncaring sun that scorched them from the moment of its rising to going down again. The children of the main group had long since ceased to even have the strength to cry, and RyAnne's heart broke each time she glimpsed the empty vacant stairs as they marched forward, simply putting one foot before the other. She had tried several times to sneak over and offer some of the children a bit of the extra fruit she took from the relative bounty she and the other segregated women were given, but twice she had been caught and dragged back, and the one time she'd succeeded, she'd only had 3 tangerines to share. She'd run out of segments within moments, and the pitiful look she'd received from the children, who were unlucky enough not to get a section of the fruit, had literally taken her to her knees in tears. Usher had found her there sobbing into her palms and dragged her back to the segregated women, and this time he'd chained her ankles to those of 2 other women, one on each side of her. "I told you nothing good could come from you letting yourself care about them," he growled. At least Moyo was still free to come and go, so each night the child continued to snuggle next to RyAnne and curl into her side for warmth, and no doubt for comfort also. RyAnne could still hardly coax more than 2 words at a time from the girl. With a sigh, she turned on her side to relieve one ankle from the painful press of the manacles. The first rays of gold-kissed coral light seeped along the edge of the eastern horizon, and RyAnne had just loosed a prayer of thanks for the privilege of seeing such beauty, even in the midst of her circumstances, when the lion's roar split the damp dawn air. RyAnne jolted upright, prickles of terror tingling across the back of her neck, for the creature was very close this time. She darted her gaze around, trying to pin down exactly which direction the horrifying roar had originated from. Not across the encampment, not behind the hill. Next to her, one of the women mewed loudly. The terrified sound sent RyAnne's heart into her throat. What was that there? She saw the flicker of movement. More, that of darker shadow shifting within a lighter one. And then, when the beast lifted his head and she could see the outline of his mane against the cold blue dawn sky, she realized that the mound of blackness she'd first thought a gnoll was actually the lion. The creature was stretched out on its belly, in the grass, not more than a stone's throw away. Moyo whimpered by her side, and RyAnne urged her to her feet and pushed her behind the line of women who were all now clambering to their knees. "Stay behind us!" Languidly, the lion turned its gaze upon her. Tongue lolling, it panted as though it might be a family dog sprawled out on the back porch. Down the line, others also located the lion and noticed how close it was. Another woman screeched, and then another. Usher and the other guard were there now, bellowing at them to get on their feet. The second guard hurled his spear at the lion, but in his haste he missed the mark, and the spear went wide. RyAnne waited for Usher to throw his, but he did not. He stood his ground just behind the line of women, watching carefully to see what the lion's next move would be. Why would he not throw it? With no guns provided to them, there wasn't much more help he could offer than that. More terrified yelps emanated from the women down the line. RyAnne scrambled to her feet only to be immediately yanked off of them when the woman next to her panicked and tried to run. The chains clanked garishly and pressed painfully into her shins as she righted herself, never taking her eyes off the creature. Agitated by all the noise, it leapt to its paws and paced a few steps one way and then back the other. Head lowered, muscles bunched, it stared at a woman just 2 down from RyAnne. RyAnne's heart hammered, and she frantically searched her memory for what Captain Dawson had said about scaring away lions. Face them, he had said. They were much less likely to attack when looking their prey in the face. And make lots of noise. That had been the solution to scaring off a great number of creatures. Loud noise. Well, there wasn't much danger of any of them turning away from the beast with him looming so close. She certainly didn't want to turn her back on it. But a terrified silence had now settled over the women, and that simply would not do. "We must all yell, together!" "Yes!" Usher took up her instruction and passed it on down the line, adding his own voice to that of the women quickly catching on to his instructions. The other guards seemed to have disappeared altogether. RyAnne raised her voice like a warrior about to strike his first blow. On top of that, she pounded her feet rapidly on the ground to make the chains around her ankles rattle loudly. Women all up and down the line followed her lead, even as they used the pounding footsteps to move themselves away from the lion as quickly as a line of people, all chained together, could move. Certainly with all this commotion, the lion should have been startled off, but instead it merely lowered its head and curled one lip into a low snarl as it padded after them. And there was a look of intent purpose in its fearsome, gleaming eyes. Usher stepped in front of the women, and now he and his spear were the only line of protection between the women and the beast. But there were too many of them, and too spread out for one man to protect. The first rays of the sun lifting above the horizon revealed the flinch of muscles rippling beneath the scruffy golden pelt, and then the lion leapt forward with a feral screech. Usher and the women lurched back, but, hampered by their chains, 2 of the women fell. They desperately scrabbled to regain their feet. With the lion's attention on the felled women, Usher leapt forward and thrust his spear into the lion's side. Yowling a bellow of pain, the lion spun toward him, and since Usher had retained his hold on the spear, perhaps with the hope of withdrawing it for another thrust, the momentum of the creature's spin knocked the shaft of the spear against Usher's still healing arm. RyAnne heard him gasp in pain just before the creature swiped out with one great paw and sent him literally flying through the air. The women cried out, and it had all happened so quickly that the 2 who had fallen were still trying to right themselves. Bellowing a roar, the lion struck out at the closest one. The captive screamed as claws tore open flesh along her leg as easily as a letter opener might split open a letter. Moyo froze behind RyAnne, and RyAnne was moving so fast when she backed into her that the momentum took them both to the ground. Sensing new prey, the lion turned toward them with another feral roar. RyAnne jumped to her feet, but fell again, because Moyo was tangled in her ankle chains. The creature padded another step toward them, the spear still protruding from its side. Behind it, Usher climbed to his feet and seemed to assess himself. RyAnne caught a glimpse of red blood against black skin in the morning gleam of the sun before she returned her attention to the lion stalking toward her. "Jesus, please help!" With a warrior's cry, Usher vaulted over the lion and landed into a crouch before the beast. He took up a stone in one hand and hurled it with all his might at the lion's head. The stone connected with a sharp crack. The beast yelped, shook its great head, and then trotted a few paces away. Women all up and down the line, seeing that rocks might be their salvation, took up stones and pelted the cat's tawny hide with them. Giving one last growl that sounded more like the whine of a petulant girl denied the privilege of a year's debutante season, the lion snapped at the spear in its side, succeeding only in bumping the spear and exacerbating the injury. With a mewl of despair, it shook its pelt, as if to remove their reproach, and trotted off into the sunrise. Relief sent a sob shuddering through RyAnne, and all up and down the line other women began to cry too. Moya was on her feet now and launched herself at RyAnne, burying her face in her neck and sobbing uncontrollably. "Honey," RyAnne soothed her hands over the child's back. "Shh, I'm all right. We're all right now. Shh, I've got you." Usher met her gaze above the child's head, and she took in the angry bleeding scratches across his chest. Thankfully he must have leapt back far enough to keep the claws from sinking in too deep, for already the blood seemed to be clotting. She would need to clean them later for him, but for now, She angled a glance to the woman the lion had injured. She lay just a few feet away, trembling in silent shock, as she stared down at a leg so severely lacerated she would likely never have the use of again. Usher snapped his fingers at the two women on either side of her.
"You there! Do your best to stop the bleeding. I will fetch Jabir."
Moyo continued to shudder, and RyAnne continued to soothe her, but all hope began to wane. Though she had escaped this lion, her future would be full of many more lions, she feared. Oh, they would have a different visage, but they would be lions all the same. Moyo whimpered again. RyAnne soothed her once more, but inside she quaked. For today she had caught a glimpse of her future, of Moyo's future too. And it was very dark and hideous. Very dark and hideous indeed.
Part 4.
The morning of the 9th day, much to Trent's relief, they finally caught up to the slave caravan. They had nearly come upon them in the late evening the night before, but Keiko had urged caution about proceeding in the dark of night, when they had no idea what they might be facing and were weaponless themselves. Other than Trent's one small pistol, which was woefully low on bullets, since they had been using it to bag small game for eating as they travelled. The only other weapons they had were the two stout clubs Keiko had selected from wind-blown branches beneath a cluster of trees a few days back. And since Trent had been nearly faint with exhaustion after walking 5 straight hours yesterday, the first time he'd done that much since his recovery, he had agreed, despite everything in him that urged him to rush into RyAnne's rescue. Knowing she was so close, even in his exhaustion, he hadn't slept well. But this morning he and Keiko had left June and Niimbu back with the rickshaw and set out to see what they could find. And when they crested the hill above the encampment, just after dawn, and crept to the edge to peer into the valley below, his body vibrated with energy that was ready to take on any battle to get to RyAnne this day. Even though they'd been following the vast swath cut through the grassland by the trampling feet of hundreds of people for more than a week, Trent had not been prepared to discover the sheer number of captives Khalifa had abducted. His gut curled with a sick feeling as he took in the valley teeming with line after line of captives all chained together. And in that moment he knew that Llewellyn Cornwall had been correct in his assessment that Khalifa had to be working with someone on the island. The only legal thing to do with all these slaves would be to ship them to Zanzibar and sell them to plantation owners. However, there were infinitely more people here than the economy on the island could absorb. They had to be smuggling them, either directly from Bagamoyo or taking them to the island and then smuggling them on from there. More likely the latter. Too many British ships patrolled the waters near Bagamoyo. Khalifa likely wouldn't want to take that risk when he could move them from a less chancy place. But they wouldn't sail them to the Stone Town harbour, for they wouldn't want to pay the duty required there. So that would limit the number of places they could take them on the island. They would need a harbour deep enough to sail into, and a place to house the captives till they could be sorted and shipped off again. Where would that be? He would have to put his mind to work on that. The encampment seemed to be writhing with a measure of chaos this morning. A man darted through the clusters of chained people calling, loudly enough that Trent could hear it through the dawn stillness, for someone named Jabir. At first, because of the clearly visible blood on the man's chest, Trent thought he was seeking medical attention for himself. But when a second man stumbled from a tent, obviously still half asleep, the injured man directed him with dramatic gestures, and with great verve and insistence back in the direction he'd come running from. Nausea dropped into the pit of Trent's stomach. Someone had obviously been hurt. What if they had come too late? Had RyAnne suffered injury just minutes before they could rescue her? If only he could hear what was being said. But from this distance the words were spoken too quietly to be understood. It was only a moment before the one who was apparently Jabir ducked back into his tent, and then emerged with a bag in his grasp, and ran in the direction the first man had pointed him. The first man moved more sedately now, but still with quick steps, to a second tent, and paused outside it to say a few quiet words. Trent pressed a fist to his mouth and watched intently. What he wouldn't give right now to have his field glasses, but they had burned along with all his other belongings in the hut he'd been bunking in back at the village. He didn't need his field glasses, however, to recognize the man who barreled out of the second tent, spewing invectives. Khalifa didn't even take time to grab his kufiya before he snatched up a rifle from just inside the door of his tent, shoved the messenger of apparent ill tidings out of his way, and dashed off in the direction in which the man named Jabir had gone. Trent batted Keiko with the back of one hand and tipped his head to indicate they should circle around and see if they could discover what had sent Khalifa off in such a dither. Maybe he'd even be able to catch Khalifa all alone. He squinted his eyes at the pleasant thought. He would like that very much. They slipped quietly away from the lip of the hill and then skirted the perimeter of the encampment at a run. Trent willed his still weakened lungs to do their duty and not fail him. But he was nonetheless panting for breath when he and Keiko pulled up behind a large jacaranda tree and peered around it to see if they could catch a glimpse of whatever Khalifa had rushed off to manage. It was probably a good thing that Trent was struggling for breath. Otherwise, the moment his gaze landed on RyAnne kneeling in the dirt, with Moyo clutched to her, he might have done something rash. As it was, the sight of her alive, safe and whole, took the last of the strength from his legs, and he dropped to his knees behind the tree. Whoever was injured, it wasn't her. Thank you, Father. Thank you. He knew it was a selfish prayer the minute it entered his thoughts. The healer, Jabir, was leaning over a woman who writhed and moaned and clutched handfuls of her hair in agony. Through the long grass, Trent couldn't quite make out the extent of her injuries, but he was close enough to clearly hear Khalifa when he snapped. Well, did it kill her, man? Jabir offered no response, other than to shake his head. Khalifa cursed and stomped a few paces away, scanning the horizon as though searching for something. Trent ducked lower and pressed his face closer to the tree. Khalifa, however, did not look in his direction. Instead, he raised his rifle above his head and yelled across the plains. I'm coming for you, beast! You aren't going to remain the terror of the savannah for long, if I have anything to say about it. He cursed the lion soundly, stomping and waving his hands in a tirade that could only have been called a temper tantrum in more genteel circles. Everything in Trent wanted to rush in and get RyAnne and Moyo immediately, but he forced himself to take a breath and wait. He would do no one any good by barreling in and getting shot by the man a second time. Presently, the injured man who had run to fetch Khalifa returned to the scene. He stopped near RyAnne, and the moment she noticed him, she set Moyo to one side and stood to her feet. The sound of chains rattling around her ankles was like a knife to Trent's heart. Would she ever be able to forgive him for failing her so utterly? She spoke softly. Asha, you must let me look at you. If he hadn't been so distraught at seeing her in chains, Trent might have smiled. The girl's caring heart ran as deep as her marrow. Captive though she was, she remained a nurturer, a healer, a kind person. The sound of her voice was like a soothing balm to dry and brittle skin. Trent's eyes dropped closed at the sweet melody of it, but only for a moment, because he could hardly bring himself to remove his gaze from her. The man, Asha, brushed her away. Later. For now we must hunt the lion and finish it. For injured as it is, it will be even more dangerous than before. Khalifa overheard the words and nodded. Yes, Asha. Fetch 3 guards. We are going after this predator, and we'll kill it here and now. I can't afford to lose any more profits to the beast. Trent's teeth ground together. Unbelievable. But this was good. Khalifa and 3 guards, and a 4th who was already injured, and, if RyAnne's reaction to him could be read, might be a trustworthy fellow. Those odds weren't great, but if he and Keiko could take out Khalifa first, the guards might capitulate to their wishes more easily. At any rate, taking them while they were away from the camp would be better than trying to take them here. The added worry out there on the plains would be the lion, which had apparently been wounded, likely by the injured guard. But with Bagamoyo only a day or 2 farther down the trail, it was act now or perhaps lose the chance to rescue RyAnne.
forever.
Usher was not long in returning with the guards, and Khalifa delineated strict instructions on how he wanted the hunt handled. And then he led his men in the direction Usher indicated. The lion had gone. Trent and Keiko crept back from the women, who remained under the watchful eye of the healer, until Trent felt sure they were hidden by the still lengthy shadows of the dawn, and then followed the party at a distance as they set off to hunt the injured lion. The hardest thing he had ever done was to walk away and leave RyAnne in chains, especially without letting her know he was here. But he prayed this would be the last time he would ever have to walk away from her again. Trent nudged Keiko and pressed his mouth close to his ear.
If they split up, we move in. If we can take out Khalifa, I think the others will surrender. But I need him alive. Do not kill him.
Khalifa was still the only one who knew the identity of whomever he was working with. Keiko nodded, and quietly they followed the hunting party. Khalifa stalked along at the front, his rifle slung over one arm, his boots thudding loudly into the dust of the game trail. Keiko shook his head, and Trent knew he was thinking the party would never catch the lion unawares, with Khalifa walking so loudly. The injured guard, Usher, was sent out in front of the party to be the tracker. But the animal's path was not hard to follow. Even trailing far back as he and Keiko were, and seeing the sign after the hunting party had trampled over it, Trent could tell that the creature was bleeding rather badly, and wasn't moving any too fast. The guard, Usher, suddenly came to a stop. Trent and Keiko crept a little closer through the grass. Khalifa cursed.
Are you sure it went in there?
Usher shrugged.
The trail stops here.
Ahead of the hunting party lay the mouth of a cave. The opening was low to the ground, and the craggy knoll into which the opening led wasn't much larger than a good-sized beaver dam might have been back in the Americas. To proceed, the hunting party would have to crawl into the cave, one person at a time, through the narrow opening. Khalifa shoved one of the guards.
Skirt around, and make sure the trail doesn't continue on the other side. This could be its den, but before we go in, I want to be sure.
The guard departed, and Keiko looked to Trent with lifted brow. Trent shook his head and held up a hand, urging him to wait. There were still 4 men there. He'd rather hold off for a few minutes to see if their odds improved. Only a moment later, the guard returned to report that the trail did not continue on the other side.
Is there another exit where the beast could escape us?
The guard nodded with a shrug.
There are many places the lion could get out. These caves probably extend beneath the land, master.
He tamped the end of the spear he carried into the dust at his feet to emphasize his point. Khalifa propped his hands on his hips. It was obvious he had no desire to go into the cave after the beast, but at the same time was reluctant to leave before killing it. After a long moment he pointed to the 3 additional guards.
You 3, station yourselves around the perimeter, in case upon going in, we chase the lion out an opening somewhere. Usher will go in first. He is already injured, and will be less of a loss to me if the lion is waiting to attack the moment we get inside.
The men trotted off, spears in hand, and Trent gave Keiko a nod. Now was as good an opportunity as they were likely to get to mount their attack. The guards would not be far enough away for his liking, but the element of surprise might provide the benefit they needed. As he and Keiko silently made their way forward, he heard Khalifa say,
Well, what are you waiting for? Get going.
Usher's lips pressed together thinly, but he did lower himself to his stomach and crawl forward into the mouth of the cave. Khalifa had his back to them as he faced the cave and watched Usher scoot inside. Trent motioned for Keiko to take the flank, and then stood. He cocked his pistol and extended it.
Good morning, Khalifa.
Khalifa jolted and started to spin around to bring his rifle up to bear, but Keiko leapt out from beside him and slammed his club down on Khalifa's wrist, sending the rifle clattering to the ground. Khalifa cursed and gripped his likely broken wrist, bending over it. He moaned,
Dawson, what are you doing here? I thought I killed you.
Trent couldn't help the smirk that tipped up one side of his lips.
You tried.
Usher thrust his head back out of the entry of the cave, obviously having heard the commotion. But Keiko had by that time appropriated Khalifa's rifle, a knife and a machete for his own use. He levelled the rifle at the guard. Usher, still on his belly in the dirt, immediately thrust his hands above his head. Kicking the knives out of reach, Keiko motioned with the gun for him to exit the cave completely, and Usher crawled forward until he could gain his feet, but kept his hands visible at all times. Keiko finished patting Khalifa down for weapons, and finding no others, gave Trent a nod. Trent kept his distance, afraid of what he might do to the man if he went any nearer. "On your knees, Khalifa. I have some questions for you, and then I'm going to haul you in for the authorities. But first we are going to march back to the encampment and release all those poor wretches." Glowering with great fervour, Khalifa dropped to his knees. "We could make a lot of money together, you and I. Why not join me instead of fighting me?" Trent scoffed. "You don't know me at all if you even think that would be a temptation for me." At that moment a movement from the top of the knoll caught Trent's gaze. The lion! The beast had not gone into the cave as they'd suspected, but had instead jumped from the ground to the peak, likely to lick its wounds in the morning sun. Khalifa must have seen the look of surprise cross Trent's face, for he partially turned to see what had caught his attention. But the lion had already launched itself at the man kneeling just in front of its den. Khalifa's shriek split the air, but he only had enough time to raise one arm before the creature's enormous fang teeth sank deeply into his shoulder, and they tumbled together into the grass. Khalifa screamed and grappled with the animal. Trent tried to set his aim on the lion, but with the two of them tumbling about as they were, he was afraid he would shoot Khalifa. The man had too much information in his head that Trent couldn't afford to lose if he was going to, once and for all, put an end to this smuggling ring. In addition to that, he wasn't even sure the .36 caliber would faze the beast. But he couldn't just stand by and watch a man get mauled to death by a lion, not even if it was Khalifa. Maybe if he could get closer. Trent approached cautiously, not wanting the lion to transfer its attention to his direction. The lion still had its teeth clamped around Khalifa's shoulder, in a grip meant to strangle. Khalifa was also pinned down by the weight of the beast, but he was still fighting. A spear, obviously from the earlier fight back at the encampment, protruded from the lion's side, and blood coated the tawny hide. Even if they could let it live, after it had apparently been killing people, the creature would never recover from such an injury. It was mercy, put it out of its misery. "Help me!" Khalifa screamed. Trent stepped closer, took a careful aim at the lion's head, and squeezed off a shot. It flinched and loosed its hold on Khalifa, then yowled most piteously. Trent shot it again, and this time it went down in a heap on the ground next to the whimpering man. With his good arm, Khalifa dragged himself away from the carcass, but his shoulder was a mangled mess and badly dislocated. His back also appeared to be broken, because his legs dragged uselessly in the dust behind him. Trent suddenly realized that Khalifa was desperately trying to reach the knives that Keiko had earlier kicked out of reach. Asha stepped forward and planted one foot on the hilt of the machete Khalifa was closest to. So, Trent had been right to think that the guards might not rush to Khalifa's aid. Seeing the betrayal of his guard, Khalifa moaned in despair. "Asha!" His fingers scrabbled to try and lift the large blade, but Asha kept it firmly pinned to the ground, and after only a moment, Khalifa gave up and collapsed onto his back in the dirt with a growl of pain. Without a word, Asha snatched up the machete as well as the knife that lay just past it and walked away. He headed around the side of the knoll, presumably to tell the other guards the news of the attack, but Trent didn't think they needed to fear any retaliation. Trent looked at Keiko and tipped a nod in the direction Asha had just gone. "Send one of them to fetch the healer, though I'm not certain there's much he will be able to do." With that, Trent approached Khalifa and squatted by his side. Seeing blood spurting from a vein in the man's shoulder, he bent closer and pressed the heel of his hand to it. Khalifa cried out from the pain of it and then squinted one eye open and scowled at him. "I would have sworn I killed you." I said, "You nearly succeeded." A garbled sound that could only be interpreted as disappointment rattled at the back of Khalifa's throat. The sun was baking down with fervent heat now, and Khalifa licked his lips.
Water. I'm sorry. I have none.
He really was sorry, too. No man deserved to die this way.
You've lived a mean and miserable existence, Khalifa. There's not much in your life to be proud of, I'm thinking.
Khalifa sputtered a derisive laugh.
You might say that. Well, here's your chance to do something good with your last minutes. Tell me who your partner is on Zanzibar. I know you are smuggling some of these slaves off the island. Who's helping you?
Blood coated Khalifa's teeth when he smiled.
Who wouldn't you like to know?
Pain must have seized him then, for he convulsed, and his eyes widened. A breath wheezed from his throat, and for a moment Trent feared that he had lost the man. But in the next instant Khalifa met his gaze again.
You'll never find it.
They were his last words. The light of life left his gaze, and his head slumped to one side. Defeat weighted Trent's shoulders. To be this close to learning the identity of the man at the top, and to have failed. But he couldn't think of that now. Slowly he wiped Khalifa's blood off his hand onto the man's kanzu. He lifted his gaze to see Asha standing quietly to one side with two of the other guards. Just to be safe, Trent trained his pistol on the men. A moment later, when the encampment's healer rushed up with the other guard, he included them under the pistol's threat. Jabir's eyes widened when he took note of the gun trained on him by a stranger and saw Khalifa on the ground next to the dead lion. Flies already crawled over both corpses.
It is too late for him. But please,
Trent nudged the air with the point of his pistol, directing the man toward Asha.
See to this man's wounds, right away.
With a grateful nod of his head, Asha sank down onto a rock, and the healer set to cleaning the gashes on his chest. Trent squatted before the men, careful to keep his coat before him.
My name is Trent Dawson. I need to know how much resistance I might face from the other guards if I go back into the encampment with the intent of setting all those people free.
Asha and Jabir exchanged glances, first with one another, and then with the other guards. But it was hard for Trent to assess the emotions contained in the looks. Finally, after a long moment, Asha spoke.
Truly, you would set them, us, all free. Indeed, all of you.
The man licked his lips as though savouring the taste of potential freedom, which had likely seemed out of his reach for many years.
There are a few guards who will protest. Those who might want to step in and take Khalifa's place now that he is gone. But most will not fight. Do you think we can quietly take these guards, the ones who might fight?
Asha nodded.
Jabir and I will help you. We can gather all the guards together as though to tell them of Khalifa's death.
Trent looked to Keiko. Doubt still lingered at the back of his mind. Should they trust these men? Keiko shrugged. But after a moment dipped his head. What did they have to lose? Trent concurred. Still, one could never be too cautious. RyAnne had at least seemed to trust Asha to some extent, had maintained enough compassion for the man to have wanted to help him back there before Khalifa made him come on the hunt. Decision made, he stood.
We will have Asha here gather all the guards in the space between Khalifa's and Jabir's tents. That way we can use the tents to shield our approach until we are right upon them.
He made sure to look the guards and Jabir in the eyes.
The healer and these other guards will have to remain here tied up until we are sure the encampment is ours.
The guards with Asha immediately started to protest, but Keiko levelled Khalifa's rifle on them, and that quieted them down with rather a great amount of haste. The next problem was what was he going to tie them with? Khalifa's knife glinted sunlight from where it had fallen in the grass. Trent took it up and used it to cut several strips from the bottom of the hem of Khalifa's kanzu. These strips he used to bind the guards and the doctor. He lashed them all three to the trunk of an acacia tree, where they would at least have some shade.
One of us will be back for you, all just as soon as the camp is ours,
he promised. And with that, he and Keiko followed Asha across the field toward the encampment. Trent wanted nothing more than to go directly to RyAnne and let her know all was now going to be well. But first he needed to ensure that none of the guards would give him trouble. Usher glanced over at him.
Your woman saved my life, and then saved my arm when the healer meant to cut it off.
Trent once more swallowed down the desire to go straight to her. He smiled.
She talks of me then.
Usher snorted at the sentiment.
She thinks you are dead, but I have heard her say your name in her sleep.
The thought gave him a little thrill. So she still missed him? Wouldn't be opposed to learning that he'd come back from the dead? He grinned, and Keiko chuckled at him. Usher paused behind a patch of bushy palms.
I will send a boy once I have gathered the guards.
And with that he slipped from their sight and into the encampment. Still uneasy about whether they could trust the man fully, Trent wondered how long they would need to wait. But 15 minutes later a small face appeared through the bushes. The boy could not be more than 10, and when he stepped into full view, Trent could see that his wrists and ankles bore the scars of shackles. Usher has sent me to fetch you, he said in a soft voice. Trent and Keiko followed the boy through clusters of apathetic captives to the center of the encampment. Keiko approached from one side of the tents with Khalifa's rifle, and Trent approached from the other. There were 9 guards besides the ones he had tied up back there with the healer, but none of them were armed with anything other than a spear. Even so, Trent knew how deadly some of them could be with their spears, so he hung back far enough to give himself a good view of the whole band of them. He held out his pistol and cleared his throat loudly to draw their attention.
Khalifa has been killed by the lion, and I have taken over this encampment now. If you give me no trouble, you may have your freedom. If you would like your freedom, lay down your spears.
It took a moment, but to a man, one after the other, they all bent and dropped their spears near their feet.
If you walk straight toward the setting sun, you will exit the encampment. Keep walking and don't come back. If Keiko or I see you again, we will shoot you on sight. Understood?
Then, knowing how much of a hardship it would be on them to be left on the plains without their spears, he added,
You may take your weapons with you. Keiko and I will escort you to the edge of the encampment.
The men expressed pleased surprise. Several of them bowed their thanks over and over again. Only one man appeared a little disgruntled as they escorted them out of the encampment. But with no one else protesting, Trent didn't think they would have any trouble from him. Keiko hung back, and Trent looked over at him. He tipped his head toward Usher. Trent transferred his attention to the man.
Yes?
Usher kept his head bowed in subservience.
With your permission, your woman saved my life. It would only be right that I remain with her until I have repaid the debt.
The truth was, Trent was glad for an extra man to help with all the work they would need to do in the hours to come. With a nod, he agreed. They waited until the guards had all disappeared over the far horizon before they turned back to the encampment. First things first. He would go see RyAnne, but then they would need to bring water and food to all these starving people before they could in good conscience release them to go back to what might be left of their villages. Hakim Chadha stepped off the boat in the Stone Town port. He had to admit that as places went, this port was probably the most putrid of harbours he'd ever had the displeasure of sailing into. The stench that hung in the air stung the nostrils and made the eyes water. A corpse bumped against the gangplank as he took the last step. And just up the beach, 2 Zanzibaris were using a net to drag another corpse onto the shore. It appeared the bodies were gathered and burned. What a dreadful place this would be to work. But there was nothing for it. He didn't have enough money to make his way to a different port. So until he could save enough to move on, this would be the place he called home. Best he start asking about for work. The sooner he found some, the sooner he could be shut of this place. He had only taken 2 steps up the dock, however, when the first wave of weakness hit him. His stomach rebelled and threatened to cast up its contents. He managed to stumble to the edge of the pier, but once on his knees and finished with the foul task, He found that his muscles refused the order to stand again.
"You there!"
A stevedore stepped closer to him.
"Be you in need of help, lad?"
"Aye," was all he managed. The stevedore carried Hakim to the nearest clinic, but the doctor had been called away to the other side of the island to tend to a birthing.
"I have to get back to work, you see. The doc, he should be long right snappy like. You just sit here on the steps, and I'll help you soon as he returns."
By the time the doctor returned, Hakim was staring sightlessly toward the sky, and a stiffness had already set into his corpse. RyAnne fidgeted nervously. She would have given just about anything could she have paced back and forth. Instead, she was consigned to being satisfied with merely standing, since her ankles were still chained to those of the women on either side of her. Khalifa had led Asha and the other guards away to hunt the lion over an hour before, and then one of the guards had rushed back and demanded that Jabir accompany him. Someone had sustained an injury, he'd said, but nothing more than that. Not even when she'd prodded for more information. Her first concern was for Asha. Had he been wounded even worse by the lion, or was it his initial wounds that were suddenly worsening? Her second concern was for the children of the camp. Normally they were fed and given water as soon as the sun rose, and since they were given so little fluids, the morning's distribution was an essential necessity for replenishing needed sustenance to small bodies. Yet Khalifa and Asha had not returned, and neither had Jabir. Muriel had curled up on the ground near her feet and returned to sleep, taking advantage of the rare extra rest she was so in need of. Most of the women had also returned to sleep. Even the woman who had been clawed seemed to have been lulled into a stupor by whatever draught Jabir had given her. Every once in a while Muriel whimpered, and RyAnne imagined dreams of the lion attack, or perhaps the attack on the village, haunted her. She stooped down and soothed her hand over the child's forehead. "Shh, Muriel, I'm here. All is well now." She heard footsteps and looked up. Asha was approaching in the distance with a bearded man she gasped and covered her mouth with one hand. That, oh, so recognizable, casual gait. Feet planted wide, like a man who'd grown up keeping his balance on sea-tossed ships. His shirt was dirty and torn, but draped over those familiar broad, sturdy shoulders. Tears filled her eyes as he came closer, making it even more difficult to focus and discern if she was losing her mind. Yet those wind-whipped curls, though several lengths longer than they had been the last time she'd seen him, could belong to none other. Still she doubted herself. Surely she was mistaken. Every limb shook with the terror that she was simply seeing the familiar in the form of a stranger. But his gaze was locked onto hers, and he was heading straight for her. Only paces away now. And when he stopped before her, there was no mistaking those grey-green eyes. No matter that most of his face was buried beneath a black beard. "Captain." The word was barely a breath, and then she lost all the strength in her legs and slipped to her knees as sobs overtook her. He knelt with her and tugged her firmly into a trembling embrace. "Shh, RyAnne, I'm here. I'm here." He cupped the back of her head and pressed his bristly cheek first against her own, then against her hair, and finally against her shoulder. His body shuddered, and a gravelly sound, half pain and half joy, slipped from the back of his throat. When she pulled back to take a second, third, and even fourth look, there were tears shimmering on his lower lids. He dashed at them as he gave a gruff bark of self-depreciating laughter and offered a watery smile. "I can't believe you are here. How?" He took her face in both his hands and pressed his forehead to hers. "I have Keiko and June to thank for saving me." A thrill most certain swept through her. "Keiko and June? Alive?" He nodded.
Animbo.
Father in heaven be praised. Nyanja came to mind, but she couldn't seem to bring herself to voice the question. Her gaze travelled to Muyo, still sleeping soundly on the ground next to them. Trent followed her gaze, and then when she met his eyes once more, shook his head.
I'm sorry.
Tears spilled anew, even though it was what she had suspected for weeks. Muyo has never said, but I think she saw her killed. A muscle bunched in Trent's jaw, and he rubbed one thumb over what she felt sure was the scar left by Khalifa's hand on her cheek. She held her breath, wondering how terrible it really looked. With no looking glass, she had no way of knowing. The truth be told, she hadn't even thought of it over the past weeks. But now, with Trent looking at her with such pity in his eyes, her heart dropped. Is it hideous? He blinked and met her gaze.
Never could the sight of you be hideous.
As touching as that sentiment might be, she wouldn't let him get away with such a blithe answer. How bad is it, truly? She pressed her lips together, almost afraid of what he might say. He bent forward until she could look nowhere but into the sincerity of his eyes.
The truth is, it is barely noticeable, but my heart breaks at what you must have gone through these past weeks.
The statement should have brought relief, but instead it weighed her down with guilt. She closed her eyes, attempting a steadying breath. He pulled her head close and pressed a kiss to her forehead.
Don't fret, RyAnne.
RyAnne felt her face crumple. Oh, Trent, I'm afraid this whole sorry mess is my fault. Khalifa said. Trent set her back from him and took her face firmly in his hands.
Never mind what Khalifa said. The man is a liar, and the lowliest of villains. This was his doing and none others. Do you hear me? None others.
What happened to him? She glanced around. The man had been such a part of her life for the past several weeks that she almost expected to see him walk up and with one swipe of his hand dissipate the illusion. Trent here before her, holding her face in his hands and speaking to her in audible tones.
Khalifa was attacked by the lion. I'm afraid he met with a very gruesome and painful ending.
At that moment, RyAnne realized Asha was unlocking the manacles on all the women up and down the line. RyAnne closed her eyes. Please, Father, don't let this all be a dream. So what is to happen to all of us? She swept a gesture to the other women nearby, and then to the camp in general.
Everyone will be freed.
He stood, pulling her up with him. He slipped his hands behind her waist, pulling her closer. She breathed in the earthy scent of him, not even caring that it was hardly the most pleasant of odours at the moment. Oh, Trent, I can hardly believe my eyes and my ears and my hands. She curled her fingers into the beard along his jaw. He bent forward and kissed her, lingering over the task.
Believe it. I'm here, right in front of you, and giddy with the joy of it.
For a long time they simply stared at one another, touched one another, breathed the same air as one another. Trent brushed her hair back from her face. There was a catch in his voice when he spoke.
I feared I wasn't going to make it in time. Forgive me for failing you.
RyAnne laid one finger over his lips. You did not fail me. There was naught that you could have done.
I have rehearsed it 1,000 times and think that surely there were a few things I should have done differently. But what's important is that we found each other again.
Indeed. He swept his hands down her arms.
I could stand here, taking in my fill of you all day. But we've much to do. We need to free and feed all these people and get them water.
Yes, of course. I will help. And as she bent to wake Muyo and watched Trent stride away giving instructions to Asha and Kiku, RyAnne couldn't help but turn her thoughts to prayer. Oh, Father, you promised me your grace was sufficient for me, and I doubted you. And yet it was. It carried me through until you could bring about the good end that you had planned for us. For this I thank you. You have taken me from this trail of chains and set my feet on the path of freedom.
If you enjoyed this audio production of The Trail of Chains, continue the story with Episode 6, The Joy of the Morning, found on Amazon, Audible, and iTunes. This has been The Trail of Chains, a serialized historical Christian romance. Sonnets of the Spice Isle, Book 5. Written by Lynnette Bonner. Narrated by Mary Sarah Agliata. Copyright 2016 by Lynnette Bonner. Production copyright 2017 by Lynnette Bonner.